My own son pressed the cold steel barrel of a 9mm Glock against my right temple. We were standing in the very study where I had taught him how to read, where I had patched up his scraped knees, where I had promised his mother I would always protect him. Across my heavy oak desk, his wife Chloe slid a stack of legal documents toward me. A customized deed of transfer and a new last will and testament. She laughed a sharp, piercing sound that bounced off the walls of my own home. "Just sign it, Terry. You are too old to manage this anyway." I did not beg. I did not plead for my life. I stared dead into my son's eyes, searching for the boy I had raised. I found nothing but a desperate, cowardly stranger. I picked up the pen and signed my name. Chloe snatched the paper so fast she nearly tore it. "Now everything is ours," she cheered. But her smile vanished the exact moment the ink dried. Red and blue lights exploded through the study window blinds. The deafening wail of police sirens surrounded the house. Darius panicked, his hands shaking as the gun wavered. Before I explain how I ended up with a gun to my head in my own home, let me know what city or state you are watching from down in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that blood does not give anyone the right to betray you. My name is Terrence Jenkins, but everyone calls me Terry. I am 73 years old, a black man who spent 40 years of his life covered in engine grease and hydraulic fluid as a heavy machinery mechanic right here in Atlanta. To the outside world, and especially to my daughter-in-law Chloe, I was just a tired old man living in a modest brick house on the south side. What neither of them knew was that every time I washed that black grease off my hands, I was studying real estate. Over the decades, I quietly built a $12 million commercial property portfolio. I own 3 shopping plazas downtown. I do not wear tailored suits. I do not drive imported sports cars. I drive a 12-year-old truck because I learned a long time ago that invisible wealth is the only wealth that keeps you safe. I kept my success hidden to protect my family. When my beautiful wife Vivian passed away 5 years ago, she made me promise to look out for Darius. He was our only child. But Darius was 38 years old and drowning in an entitlement I never understood. He wanted the lifestyle of a millionaire without putting in a single hour of the sweat equity it required. And then he married Chloe. Chloe was a 34-year-old white woman who viewed my son as a meal ticket and viewed me as a relic of a past she wanted to bulldoze over. She looked down on my neighborhood, my clothes, and my quiet life. She possessed a subtle but vicious prejudice, believing she was inherently smarter and more deserving of whatever I had. Let us go back exactly 4 months to the day this nightmare began. The day I foolishly opened my door and let the enemy inside. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when Darius drove his expensive leased SUV up my driveway. He and Chloe were standing on my porch with 6 luxury suitcases. Darius looked nervous, refusing to meet my eyes, but Chloe had a bright plastic smile plastered across her face. They claimed their high-end condo was undergoing massive renovations due to black mold and water damage. They needed a place to stay for just a few weeks. They said it would be wonderful to spend some quality family time together. I knew they were lying. A father always knows. I could smell the desperation on my son, a sour mix of cheap cologne and anxiety. I noticed the way Chloe kept looking over her shoulder at the street as if she expected someone to be following them. But I remembered the promise I made to Vivian on her deathbed. I stepped aside and let them in. That was my first mistake. Within 2 hours of crossing my threshold, Chloe began her invasion. She did not unpack her bags. She started rearranging my life. I was sitting in the kitchen quietly drinking my black coffee when I heard the heavy thud of a garbage bag hitting the hardwood floor in the hallway. I walked out and saw Chloe casually tossing Vivian's belongings into a black plastic trash bag. My late wife's hand-stitched quilts, the old photo albums we had kept on the mahogany shelf, the vintage magazines she loved to read. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Chloe barely looked at me. "Oh, Terry, there is just so much clutter in here. We need space for our things. You really should not be hoarding all this junk anyway. It is bad for your health." I did not yell. Yelling is what people do when they have no control. I walked over, reached into the garbage bag and pulled out Vivian's quilt. I smoothed the fabric with my rough hands. I looked at Chloe. "This is not junk. This is my life. Do not touch my wife's things again." Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh. She turned to Darius, who had just walked in carrying another suitcase. "Darius, your dad acts like he is still living in the projects. We are just trying to modernize this dusty old place." I waited for my son to defend his mother's memory. I waited for him to tell his wife to respect the house that put food in his mouth and clothes on his back. Instead, Darius shifted his weight and looked at the floor. "Dad, come on," he mumbled. "Chloe is just trying to help. You should apologize to her. We are guests here. Apologize to her, in my own home, for defending the memory of the woman who gave him life." I looked at my son, a grown man wearing a watch that cost more than my first car, defending a woman who viewed us both with thinly veiled contempt. I did not say another word. I picked up the photo albums and walked back to my room. I realized right then that they were not here to visit. They were here to conquer. The war had officially begun, and I was going to need to fight it in the shadows. Over the next few days, I watched as they took over my living room, my kitchen, my peace. They complained about the food I cooked. They complained about the temperature of the house. They complained about the neighborhood. But I am a mechanic. I know how to diagnose a broken machine. I started paying close attention to the small things, the hushed phone calls Darius made in the backyard late at night, the past due notices Chloe tried to hide at the bottom of the recycling bin, the way they jumped every time a car drove slowly past the house. I began to notice a pattern in their behavior. Every morning, Chloe would wake up and immediately check her phone with shaking hands. She wore designer clothes, but she washed them in the sink because she was terrified of taking them to the dry cleaners. Darius paced the hallways like a caged animal. He drank my expensive bourbon like it was water. He stopped going to his supposed job, claiming he was working remotely, but his laptop was always closed. They thought I was just a blind old man who spent his days watching television and tending to the garden. They thought my silence was weakness, but my silence was calculation. Every time they left the house to go to the grocery store or pretend to run errands, I went into their guest room. I did not touch anything. I just observed. I saw the stacks of unpaid credit card bills shoved under the mattress. I saw the threatening letters from a local loan agency that Darius had tried to burn in the fireplace but failed to destroy completely. I realized that the son I had worked so hard to protect had become a master of deception. He had built a life on a foundation of sand, and now the tide was coming in. And instead of facing the storm like a man, he had brought it to my doorstep, hoping I would drown in his place. But I survived the civil rights movement. I survived 40 years of backbreaking labor. I survived the loss of the only woman I ever truly loved. I was not going to let a spoiled child and his arrogant wife take what was mine. I knew they were planning something. I could see the greed in Chloe's eyes every time she looked at my house. I could see the desperation in Darius every time his phone rang. They were circling me like vultures, waiting for the right moment to strike. What they did not know was that they had walked straight into a trap of their own making. I was about to teach them the most painful lesson of their lives. The peace in my house lasted exactly 48 hours. After my beautiful wife Vivian passed away 5 years ago, the silence inside these brick walls had become my only sanctuary. I had my quiet routine. I drank my coffee black at 6 in the morning while watching the sun rise over Atlanta. I tended to the tomatoes in the backyard garden that Vivian used to love so much. I read the morning paper in my favorite armchair. But the very moment Darius and Chloe dragged their 6 massive luxury suitcases across my original hardwood floors, that hard-earned peace was brutally assassinated. Chloe treated my home like a health inspector touring a condemned building. She walked through the living room with her nose wrinkled in disgust as if the very air was beneath her high standards. She complained constantly about the floral wallpaper Vivian had carefully picked out in 1998. She complained about the smell of old wood and the lack of modern lighting. She complained about the neighborhood, about the neighbors, and about the lack of gourmet coffee in my pantry. I sat at the kitchen table and watched her. I did not say a single word. I just observed her erratic, arrogant movements while Darius paced the hallway like a man waiting for a death sentence. He refused to make eye contact with me. On the 3rd morning, I walked out to the alley behind my house to take out the weekly recycling. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, but I felt a sudden cold chill run down my spine when I opened the lid of the large green bin. Sitting right there, completely exposed on top of discarded pizza boxes and empty imported wine bottles, were Vivian's hand-stitched quilts. These were the very same quilts she had spent 6 agonizing months sewing by hand for our 20th wedding anniversary. My heart stopped beating for a heavy, terrifying second. I pushed the cardboard boxes aside and found even more discarded treasures. I found the heavy leather-bound photo albums containing precious pictures of Darius as a newborn baby. Pictures of Vivian smiling brightly in our backyard during summer barbecues. Pictures of a loving family that this strange woman was actively trying to erase from existence. I pulled the albums out of the garbage one by one. I carefully brushed the wet coffee grounds off the leather covers. My hands were shaking violently, but it was not from the frailty of old age. It was from a deep, dark, calculating rage. I spent 40 grueling years waking up at 4 in the morning to go work on massive, heavy machinery. I spent 60-hour weeks covered from head to toe in thick black engine grease and toxic hydraulic fluid. My back still aches every single time it rains because I spent decades carrying heavy transmissions and lifting solid steel parts just to put food on the table. I literally destroyed my own physical body so my son would never have to know what a calloused hand felt like. I paid for his expensive college tuition entirely in cash so he would not be trapped by predatory student loans. I bought his first reliable car. I gave him the entire world on a silver platter, and he simply handed it over to a woman who threw his own mother's precious memories into the garbage like they were absolutely nothing. I quietly carried the quilts and the heavy albums back into the house. I am a very patient man. I did not scream or break things. I took the rescued items straight to my bedroom and locked them safely inside my personal closet. Then I walked slowly back into the kitchen. Chloe was standing by the marble counter wearing expensive designer silk pajamas. She was drinking imported sparkling water from a glass she had bought herself because she completely refused to drink from our normal household cups. She looked at me and let out an exaggerated theatrical sigh. She told me that the place was far too cluttered and that they desperately needed to open up the space. She said it felt suffocating and that all the old junk was just collecting dust and causing her allergies to flare up. I did not answer her right away. I turned my back to walk toward the sink, and that is exactly when I saw it. The heavy black cast iron skillet was sitting at the very bottom of the metal trash can next to the kitchen island. That specific skillet belonged to Vivian's mother, who brought it with her when she moved to Georgia. Vivian had cooked Sunday dinners in that pan for 40 wonderful years. It was perfectly seasoned with decades of rich family history and love. It was a priceless family heirloom that connected us to our ancestors. Chloe had carelessly tossed it in the garbage right on top of wet paper towels and broken eggshells. I reached deep into the trash and pulled out the heavy skillet. The dense metal felt cold and familiar in my rough hands. I turned to face Chloe directly. I asked her very quietly and very calmly why the skillet was sitting in the trash. Chloe rolled her blue eyes and crossed her arms over her chest, acting like I was the one being completely unreasonable. She told me not to make a massive deal out of absolutely nothing. She said the pan was ancient and completely black and looked absolutely filthy to her. She bragged loudly that she had already ordered a brand new set of expensive non-stick ceramic pans online and that they would arrive by delivery tomorrow. She stated firmly that they could not possibly be expected to cook their meals on that dirty, disgusting thing. I gripped the iron handle of the skillet tightly. I looked her dead in her eyes and kept my voice dangerously steady, preventing any emotion from slipping through. I told her that the skillet belonged to my late wife. I told her she would never ever touch anything in my kitchen again. I told her she would never throw away a single item in my house again as long as she lived. I made it absolutely and perfectly clear that if she did not like the way my house looked or functioned, she was more than welcome to pack her expensive designer bags and leave my property immediately. Chloe actually gasped. Her pale face turned bright red with pure indignation and shock. She was clearly not used to being told no by anyone. She was entirely used to weak, passive men like my son who bent over backward to give her everything she selfishly demanded. She glared at me with a look of absolute disgust. She muttered under her breath, but she made very sure it was loud enough for me to clearly hear. She said that I acted like I was still living in the projects, and that it was no wonder the whole place looked like an absolute dump. The racist and classist venom dripping from her voice was unmistakable. She looked at me not as a father-in-law or an elder worthy of respect, but as a lesser human being who was standing in her way. At that exact moment, Darius walked into the kitchen from the hallway. He heard exactly what his wife just said. He saw me holding his dead mother's cast iron skillet pulled fresh from the garbage. But instead of defending his father, instead of demanding basic respect for the house he grew up in, he rushed straight to his wife's side. He put his arm protectively around Chloe and glared at me like I was the enemy. Darius raised his voice and demanded to know what my problem was. He claimed Chloe was just trying to make the place livable for them. He said she was under a massive amount of stress right now and that they both were dealing with difficult things. He told me I could not just talk to his wife like that in any situation. Then my own son looked me directly in the eye and demanded that I apologize to her right then and there. I stared at him in complete and utter disbelief. My own flesh and blood, the boy I broke my back to raise, was demanding that I apologize to a woman who had just thrown his mother's legacy in the garbage and racially insulted his father in his own home. I looked at Darius closely. I looked at the expensive gold watch gleaming on his wrist. I looked at the absolute fear and cowardice hiding right behind his angry eyes. I realized right then that the boy I raised was completely gone forever. He was not just being manipulated by a toxic, greedy woman. He was a willing, eager participant in my disrespect. He had clearly chosen his side, and it was definitively not mine. I did not argue with him. Arguing with a fool only proves there are two fools in the room. I took the cast iron skillet to the kitchen sink. I washed it carefully with warm water and soap. I dried it completely with a clean cotton towel. I walked right past the two of them without saying another single word. I went straight to my bedroom and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I sat on the edge of my mattress, holding the heavy metal pan resting in my lap. Through the thin walls of the house, I listened to Chloe complaining loudly in the kitchen. I listened to her telling Darius how impossible I was to deal with and how much she absolutely hated being trapped here. I listened to my son apologizing to her profusely. I listened to him begging her to calm down and assuring her that they would get things sorted out very soon. I knew exactly what getting things sorted out meant to a snake like her and a coward like him. They genuinely thought I was just a tired old man holding on to the past, waiting to die. They thought they could slowly push me out of my own territory until I finally gave up and surrendered control. They thought their sophisticated manipulation tactics would wear me down mentally and physically. But they did not understand the kind of man they were dealing with. I had faced men far more dangerous and ruthless than my cowardly son and his arrogant wife. I spent my entire life building a massive financial fortress of security so my family would never have to struggle. Now I realized I had to use that very same fortress to ruthlessly defend myself against them. Sitting in the quiet of my locked bedroom, I let the silence wash over me completely. The sorrow of losing my son to greed was incredibly heavy, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. The war had officially begun in my house. I was not going to fight them with screaming matches or emotional pleas for respect. I was going to let them believe they were winning the battles. I was going to let them get so incredibly comfortable in their blind arrogance that they would not even see the trap until it completely and utterly destroyed them. I placed Vivian's skillet safely on my wooden dresser, right next to her framed picture. I made a silent, solemn promise to her right then and there. I promised I would protect everything we built together, even if it meant completely destroying the very sun we created. The humid Atlanta air hung heavy over my front porch as I walked out to check the morning mail. It was a quiet Thursday and the neighborhood was still. The postman had just driven away, leaving a stack of letters inside my rusted metal mailbox. I sorted through the usual junk mail and utility bills. But right in the middle of the stack, I felt something entirely different. It was a thick, heavy manila envelope addressed directly to Darius. There was no return address printed on the corner. The postage was not standard. It looked like it had been hand-delivered by someone who wanted to make sure it was seen. My calloused fingers traced the edge of the thick paper. A father should respect his grown son's privacy. A father should hand the mail over without a second thought. But the boy sleeping in my guest room was no longer the son I raised. He was a desperate stranger hiding behind a manipulative woman. I remembered the nervous way he paced the hallways late at night. I remembered the way he jumped every time a car drove slowly past our street. I knew this envelope held the dark answers they were trying so desperately to hide from me. I did not go back inside the house. I walked straight into my detached garage and closed the heavy wooden door behind me. The smell of motor oil and sawdust always gave me peace and clarity. I sat down at my old workbench. I took a flathead screwdriver and carefully sliced open the top of the manila envelope. I slid the contents onto the wooden table. There was a thick stack of financial documents printed on cheap paper. But these were not official bank statements. This was a crude, handwritten ledger. I recognized the name printed at the top of the threatening letter attached to the front. It was a notorious local loan agency operating out of the shadows in the city. They were vicious loan sharks, the kind of dangerous men who break legs first and ask for their money second. I put on my reading glasses and stared at the numbers. The bold black ink told a story of absolute reckless stupidity. Darius owed exactly $250,000. The ledger detailed a long, pathetic history of illegal sports gambling debts and massive losses in failed cryptocurrency investments. He had been borrowing money to cover his losses and then borrowing more to pay the exorbitant illegal interest rates. He was trapped in a financial death spiral that he could never escape on his own. But the envelope contained much more than just his gambling debts. There were copies of credit card statements attached to the very back. These were final collection notices for accounts held entirely in Chloe's name. The statements showed tens of thousands of dollars spent on luxury designer handbags, expensive imported shoes, and high-end resort vacations. While my son was drowning in illegal debt to dangerous men, his arrogant wife was living like a billionaire on maxed-out credit cards. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with perfect clarity. The story about their expensive condo undergoing renovations due to black mold was a complete and utter lie. They did not move in with me to spend quality family time. They moved in because they were absolutely broke and running out of places to hide. They had likely been evicted or forced to sell everything just to stay one step ahead of the violent men looking for their money. And now they had brought that massive, dangerous target right to my front door. I sat in the dim light of my garage for a very long time. The anger I felt was not hot and explosive. It was freezing cold. Darius had endangered my life and my property because he was too weak to tell his wife no. He was too cowardly to admit his failures to her. Instead, he brought his toxic mess into the only safe sanctuary I had left. I folded the documents carefully and placed them inside my locking toolbox. I locked the metal drawer and slipped the small key into my front pocket. I walked back inside the house. Chloe was sitting on the living room sofa, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. She was wearing another brand new silk outfit that she obviously could not afford. Darius was staring out the window, chewing nervously on his fingernails. I walked past them and went into the kitchen to prepare dinner. I took my time chopping vegetables and seasoning the chicken. I let the heavy silence stretch out through the entire house. I knew they were getting desperate, and desperate people always make massive mistakes. They just needed a little push to reveal their true intentions. That night we sat around my heavy oak dining table. I served the food quietly. Darius kept his head down, pushing the rice around his plate like a guilty child. Chloe, however, had a bright fake smile plastered across her painted face. She took a sip of her water and cleared her throat loudly. She told me that the chicken was surprisingly edible today. I did not thank her for the backhanded insult. I just chewed my food and waited for the performance to begin. Chloe leaned forward and rested her elbows on the table. She said that she and Darius had been doing a lot of deep thinking about the future. She claimed Darius had an incredible new business venture that was absolutely guaranteed to make millions. She used a lot of sophisticated corporate buzzwords to make it sound legitimate. She talked about market shares and massive returns on investment. Darius nodded along nervously, but he still refused to look me in the eye. I put my fork down. I asked her exactly what kind of business venture required them to live in my guest room rent-free. Chloe let out a small, artificial laugh. She said that starting a new empire required liquid capital. She stated that all their funds were currently tied up in complex assets. Then she folded her hands together and delivered the shameless pitch she had been rehearsing all day. She told me that since I was living alone in a house that was completely paid off, I was sitting on a gold mine of useless equity. She explained that I was simply hoarding wealth that I did not even know how to spend. She suggested with absolute boundless confidence that I should take out a massive reverse mortgage on my home. She said the bank would give me hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash right away. She wanted me to hand all of that cash over to Darius to fund his imaginary business. She promised they would pay me back with interest within a single year. I looked at the arrogant woman sitting across from me. She was asking me to sign away the very home I bought with 40 years of backbreaking labor. She was asking me to risk my shelter and my security to pay off illegal gambling debts and fund her endless luxury shopping habits. She honestly believed I was a stupid, naive old man who would gladly hand over my life savings just to keep her happy. I wiped my mouth with a simple cloth napkin. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate. I looked directly into her cold blue eyes. I told her in a very calm and steady voice that I would absolutely never take out a loan on my house. I told her that my property was not a bank for her to rob. I said my answer was no, and that my answer would remain no until the day I was put in the ground. The temperature in the dining room dropped instantly. Chloe's fake sweet smile vanished completely. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The concerned daughter-in-law routine evaporated into thin air. The real Chloe finally stepped out from the shadows to show her true colors. She slammed her hands down hard on the wooden table. The silverware rattled violently against the ceramic plates. She leaned across the table and yelled that I was a stubborn, ignorant old man. She said I was hoarding wealth that I did not deserve and did not know how to manage properly. She told me I was completely selfish for holding my own son back from the success he was entitled to. Her voice grew louder and more vicious with every single word. She insulted my intelligence. She insulted my simple lifestyle. She practically spit her words at me, claiming I was dragging them down to my miserable, pathetic level. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her screaming. I slowly turned my head and looked at Darius. My son was sitting there listening to his wife viciously attack his own father in his childhood home. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for him to defend the man who gave him everything. I waited for him to tell his wife to show some basic human respect in this house. Darius did not say a word. He shrank down in his chair, looking everywhere except at me. He was completely terrified of her, and completely willing to let me be abused if it meant saving his own skin from her wrath. He traded his dignity for her approval a very long time ago. I stood up from the table. I towered over both of them. I looked down at Chloe and told her that dinner was over. I told her that she was eating food paid for by my money, sitting in a chair bought by my money, resting under a roof secured by my money. I made it perfectly clear that the only reason she had a place to sleep tonight was because of my charity. Chloe scoffed and rolled her eyes. She stood up abruptly, nearly knocking her chair backward onto the floor. She grabbed Darius by his arm and pulled him up roughly. She muttered that they did not have to sit here and take abuse from an ungrateful old fool. She dragged my son away from the table and marched straight down the hallway. They slammed the door to the guest room so hard the picture frames on the wall rattled violently. I remained standing in the silent dining room. I looked at the half-eaten plates of food left on the table. The masks were completely off now. The polite fiction we had been maintaining for the past few days was entirely destroyed. They knew I was not going to hand over my money willingly. I knew they were desperate, dangerous, and completely cornered. They needed $250,000 to save their lives from ruthless criminals. They had just realized I was not going to be their willing victim. Desperate people do not just pack up and leave when they are told no. Desperate people change their tactics. They escalate the situation until they get exactly what they want. I walked over to the kitchen sink and began washing the dishes. The warm water ran over my rough hands. I knew the war had officially entered a new and dangerous phase. Chloe was not going to stop. She was going to try to take my house by force. She was going to use every manipulative, vicious trick she knew to break me down mentally and physically. She thought I was an isolated, weak old man who could easily be crushed. But she did not know about my corporate lawyer. She did not know about my massive commercial real estate portfolio. She did not know that I spent my entire life outsmarting greedy people exactly like her. They thought they had declared war on a defenseless elder. They had actually declared war on a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The battle lines were drawn in my own home, and I was more than ready to watch them destroy themselves. The morning after I refused to hand over the equity in my home, the atmosphere inside the house changed completely. The screaming stopped. The loud slamming of doors ended. Chloe and Darius woke up with sweet artificial smiles and soft voices. I knew immediately that this sudden peace was far more dangerous than their open anger. They had realized that intimidation would never work on a man like me, so they decided to switch their tactics. They decided to attack my mind. It started with a small, calculated annoyance. I was getting ready to drive down to the local hardware store on a Tuesday morning. For 40 years, I have always hung my heavy set of truck keys on the exact same brass hook right next to the front door. I am a professional mechanic. My entire life was built on strict organization. If I misplace a wrench or a socket, I could ruin an engine and lose my job. I never misplace my tools, and I certainly never misplace my keys. But that morning, the brass hook was completely empty. I checked my pockets. I checked the wooden table in the hallway. Nothing. I walked into the living room where Chloe was pretending to read a magazine. She looked up with wide, innocent eyes and asked me what was wrong. I told her I could not find my keys. Darius rushed into the room acting incredibly concerned. They both started tearing the house apart looking for them. 10 minutes later, Chloe called out from the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator door and pulled my keys out from right next to the milk carton. She looked at me with fake pity. and told me that my memory was really starting to slip. Darius patted my shoulder and told me I needed to be much more careful. I looked at the cold metal keys resting in her pale hand. I knew for an absolute fact that I did not put them in the refrigerator. The gaslighting had officially begun. I did not argue with them. I just nodded heavily and took my keys. I drove away knowing they were testing my reactions. 3 days later, they escalated their psychological warfare to a terrifying new level. I was sitting in my backyard garden, pulling weeds around the tomato plants. Suddenly, I smelled something sharp and dangerous drifting through the open kitchen window. It was the distinct, heavy smell of natural gas. I dropped my gardening tools and hurried inside the house. The front left burner of my gas stove was turned all the way up, but there was no flame. The kitchen was quickly filling with toxic, invisible fumes. Before I could even reach the dial, Chloe came running down the wooden stairs, screaming at the top of her lungs. She covered her mouth and yelled that I was trying to blow up the entire house. Darius rushed in right behind her. He quickly turned off the burner and opened all the windows. He grabbed my arm and dragged me into the living room, treating me like a confused, helpless child. He raised his voice and told me that my mind was completely failing. He said I had turned on the stove to make tea and forgot to ignite the flame. He said I could have killed all of us in a massive explosion. Chloe started fake crying and buried her face in her hands. She sobbed loudly, telling Darius that it was no longer safe for them to live here with an unstable old man. I stood there listening to their perfectly rehearsed performance. I had not been inside the kitchen all morning. I drank my coffee on the porch and went straight to the garden. I knew exactly who turned that dial. They were deliberately trying to make me doubt my own sanity. They wanted to build a solid case that I was a dangerous, senile old fool who needed to be locked away for his own good. But their ultimate betrayal came exactly a week later. It was the kind of evil betrayal that destroys whatever tiny shred of love a father has left for his son. Every morning I take a specific pill for my blood pressure. I have taken the exact same medication for 10 years. The pills are small, smooth, and slightly blue. That morning I opened my plastic pill organizer to take my daily dose. I poured the small blue pill into the palm of my rough hand. I immediately noticed something was terribly wrong. The pill felt slightly different against my calloused skin. The texture was chalky and the tiny numbers stamped on the top were completely missing. A normal person might have just swallowed it without a second thought. But I spent 4 decades inspecting tiny mechanical parts for invisible flaws. I placed the pill on my tongue, but I did not swallow it. It tasted sweet. It was pure sugar. I spit the fake pill into the sink and washed it down the drain. A freezing cold wave of absolute horror washed over my entire body. They had not just stolen my keys or messed with my stove. They were actively tampering with my daily heart medication. They were trying to induce a massive stroke or a fatal heart attack. They wanted me to die naturally or suffer a medical emergency severe enough to leave me completely incapacitated. If I died, they would inherit everything immediately. If I became a vegetable, they would gain absolute control over my medical and financial decisions. My own flesh and blood was slowly and quietly trying to murder me in my own home. I felt a burning rage so deep and profound it nearly brought me to my knees. But I did not march into the living room and demand answers. I did not throw them out into the street. Confronting them would only make them deny everything and find another deadlier way to take me out. I needed absolute concrete proof of their malicious conspiracy. I needed to trap them in a web of their own creation. I went back into the hallway and put on my jacket. I told Darius and Chloe that I was feeling a little confused and just wanted to take a slow drive around the neighborhood to clear my head. Chloe gave me a condescending smile and told me to please be careful. Darius told me not to get lost. I drove straight across town to a specialty electronics store located far away from my neighborhood. I walked down the aisles and purchased 4 high-definition microcameras. They were incredibly small lenses hidden inside ordinary objects like digital alarm clocks and wall chargers. I paid entirely in cash so there would be no paper trail. I drove back to my house and waited for the perfect opportunity. Later that afternoon, Chloe forced Darius to take her out to a fancy restaurant because she refused to eat my simple home-cooked meals. The moment their leased luxury vehicle pulled out of the driveway, I went to work. I am a mechanic. Taking things apart and putting them together flawlessly is what I do best. I installed the first hidden camera directly inside the smoke detector in the main living room. It gave me a perfect wide-angle view of the sofa and the front door. I installed the second camera right inside the kitchen wall outlet facing the stove and the refrigerator. I placed the third camera in the hallway facing the door to my master bedroom. I linked all the wireless cameras to a secure encrypted application on my personal tablet. I tested the audio and video feeds. The quality was crystal clear. I could hear a pin drop in the kitchen. I locked the tablet safely inside my heavy metal tool chest in the detached garage. When Darius and Chloe returned from their expensive dinner, I was sitting in my armchair watching a baseball game on television. I played the part of the tired, defeated old man flawlessly. I looked at my son and told him I was feeling very tired and that maybe my mind really was playing tricks on me lately. I saw the immediate gleam of greedy triumph in Chloe's pale blue eyes. Darius patted my shoulder and told me everything was going to be okay. He promised he would take care of everything for me. I thanked him and slowly walked to my bedroom, locking the wooden door securely behind me. Later that night, while the house was completely dark and silent, I walked out to my garage and unlocked my metal tool chest. I pulled out my tablet and opened the secure surveillance application. I watched the live high-definition feed of my own living room. Darius and Chloe were sitting on my sofa drinking my expensive bourbon. The audio picked up their hushed voices with perfect, terrifying clarity. I listened as Chloe laughed about how incredibly easy it was to swap my blood pressure pills while I was out in the garden. I watched Darius nod his head and casually agree that my heart would probably just give out within the next few weeks. He said it would be a tragic but completely natural passing, and that no one would ever suspect a thing. Chloe told him that if I did not have a heart attack soon, they would just have to slowly increase the gas on the stove until I passed out from the toxic fumes. She said it was only a matter of time before the senile old fool made a fatal mistake. I sat in the cold, dark garage listening to my son calmly discuss my murder with his ruthless wife. The final piece of my parental love died right there in the shadows. They thought they were expertly gaslighting a foolish old man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. They did not realize they were starring in a high-definition documentary of their own criminal conspiracy. I was not losing my mind. I was gathering the exact ammunition I needed to completely and utterly destroy theirs. The trap was perfectly set, and I was going to let them walk right into the jaws of absolute ruin. The morning sun baked the Atlanta asphalt as I prepared to leave my house. I put on my worn-out corduroy jacket and an old, faded baseball cap. I walked into the living room, shuffling my feet just a little more than usual. I let my shoulders slump. I made my hands tremble as I reached for the front doorknob. Chloe was sitting on the sofa sipping her imported sparkling water. Darius was watching television. I told them my chest was feeling a little tight and I was going to take the bus down to the local clinic for a walk-in appointment. Chloe did not even bother to look up from her phone. She just smirked and told me to take my time. Darius mumbled something about being careful on the stairs. They honestly believed they had already won. They thought my mind was rotting and my body was finally giving out. They thought sending me out into the city alone would just exhaust me further. They did not know that the tired old mechanic shuffling out of their sight was about to build an impenetrable legal fortress right under their noses. I did not go to the local clinic. I walked 3 blocks down the street and hailed a private car service. I told the driver to take me straight to the financial district in downtown Atlanta. 30 minutes later, I was stepping out onto the polished marble floors of a massive glass skyscraper. I took the private elevator up to the 47th floor. The receptionist at the front desk stood up immediately when she saw me. She greeted me with absolute respect. She did not see a senile old man in a faded jacket. She saw one of the most important clients in the entire building. She escorted me directly into the corner office of my corporate attorney, Jada. Jada is a brilliant, ruthless African-American woman in her late 30s. She wears sharp, tailored suits and commands every single room she enters. Darius and Chloe have absolutely no idea she even exists. My son thinks my only legal representation is the cheap neighborhood notary we used for my late wife's basic paperwork. He has no idea that the woman sitting across from me manages a massive commercial empire. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window in Jada's office. I looked down at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I could clearly see the rooftops of the 3 downtown shopping plazas I purchased back in the 1990s. Back then, the land was cheap and the city was struggling. While my coworkers at the mechanic shop were spending their paychecks on flashy cars and expensive watches, I was wearing grease-stained overalls and quietly buying commercial real estate. I worked 60 hours a week fixing heavy machinery just to pay the mortgages on those properties. Over the decades, the city grew and my investments exploded in value. My commercial tenants include massive national grocery chains and corporate banks. My quiet, invisible net worth currently sits at exactly $12 million. Jada poured me a glass of water and asked me why I had requested such an urgent emergency meeting. I sat down in the leather chair across from her sleek, modern desk. I did not sugarcoat the truth. I told her that my only son and his greedy wife had moved into my house to escape massive illegal gambling debts. I told her they were hiding my keys and tampering with my gas stove to make me think I was losing my mind. Then I placed the fake sugar pill on her glass desk. I told her they were actively swapping my blood pressure medication to induce a fatal heart attack. Jada's professional composure shattered for a brief second. Her eyes widened in pure horror and disgust. She immediately reached for her desk phone and told me she was calling the police and the district attorney to have them arrested for attempted murder. I placed my rough hand over hers and gently pushed the phone down. I told her no. I explained that if we called the police right now, they would simply deny everything. They would claim I was just a confused old man inventing crazy stories. They would say the sugar pill was a simple mistake. I needed them to fall completely into a trap they could never, ever escape. I needed to make sure they destroyed themselves with their own boundless greed. Jada leaned back in her chair. She looked at me with a fierce, protective determination. She asked me exactly what I wanted to do. I told her we needed to restructure my entire estate immediately. We needed to build a wall so high and so thick that they would break their own necks trying to climb it. Jada nodded slowly and opened her secure laptop. We spent the next 3 hours drafting the most aggressive legal documents her firm had ever created. We moved my house, my bank accounts, and all 3 of my commercial shopping plazas into a newly formed irrevocable blind trust. I surrendered my direct individual control over the assets, making the trust the absolute legal owner of my entire $12 million empire. But we did not stop there. I needed a specific, devastating failsafe. Jada smiled a cold, calculating smile and suggested we create what corporate lawyers call a poison pill clause. We drafted a highly specific legal trigger directly into the foundation of the trust. The clause stated that if I, Terrence Jenkins, ever signed any document transferring wealth, granting power of attorney, or altering my medical directives without Jada being physically present in the room, the poison pill would automatically activate. If Darius and Chloe forced me to sign a fake will or a fraudulent deed the very moment the ink touched the paper, my entire estate would instantly lock down. Every single bank account would completely freeze. All property transfers would be legally null and void. Most importantly, the unauthorized signature would automatically trigger an emergency alert to a private security firm and the local police department reporting a verified hostage situation and felony extortion. It was a brilliant invisible landmine. Chloe could put a pen in my hand. Darius could threaten me. They could forge whatever documents they wanted. But the second they tried to use those documents, my wealth would become completely untouchable, and the police would be dispatched to arrest them for elder abuse and fraud. They were digging their own graves, and my signature would be the dirt burying them alive. Jada printed the massive stack of legal documents. I read through every single page carefully. I picked up the heavy gold pen from her desk and signed my name on the dotted lines. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a massive weight lift off my tired shoulders. My legacy was finally secure. The wealth I built for Vivian and our future was permanently protected from the cowardly boy who betrayed us. Jada gathered the documents and locked them inside her fireproof safe. She looked at me and promised that she would monitor my situation 24 hours a day. She said she would have a private security team on standby waiting for my signal. I thanked her for her loyalty and her brilliant mind. I left the towering glass skyscraper and took a private car back to my neighborhood. I had the driver drop me off 3 blocks away so I could walk the rest of the distance. By the time I reached my front porch, I made sure my breathing was heavy and ragged. I let my shoulders drop and I dragged my feet across the wooden steps. I opened the front door and stumbled slightly into the hallway. Chloe was sitting in the exact same spot on the sofa, painting her fingernails. Darius was pacing near the kitchen looking at his phone. I let out a weak, pathetic sigh. I told them the clinic was too crowded and I got confused about which bus to take home. I asked Chloe if she could please fetch me a glass of cold water because my heart was fluttering and my head felt dizzy. Chloe rolled her eyes in profound annoyance. She muttered under her breath about how useless and pathetic I was becoming. She loudly dropped her nail polish on the coffee table and marched into the kitchen to get the water. Darius looked at me with a sickening expression of fake pity. He guided me to my armchair and told me I really needed to stop leaving the house alone. He said it was getting far too dangerous for a man in my rapidly declining condition. I took the glass of water from Chloe with shaking hands. I spilled a few drops on my shirt on purpose just to sell the performance. They looked at each other and shared a sinister, knowing smile. They honestly believed their psychological torture was working perfectly. They thought I was crumbling under the weight of my own rotting mind. I drank the water slowly and looked at the two of them. I played the vulnerable, broken victim flawlessly. But behind my tired eyes, my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I was sitting inside an impenetrable financial fortress. I held all the cards. I controlled the entire board. They were just two foolish, greedy rats dancing around a loaded trap, completely unaware that the heavy steel bar was about to snap their necks. The weekend arrived with a heavy, suffocating heat that settled over Atlanta. I was sitting in my favorite armchair pretending to struggle with the crossword puzzle in the Sunday paper. I made sure to hold the newspaper upside down for a few minutes just in case Chloe was watching me from the kitchen. She was. I could feel her cold blue eyes burning into the side of my head. 30 minutes later, a sleek silver imported sedan pulled into my driveway. A man stepped out. He was tall and white with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive tailored suit hiding underneath a pristine white lab coat. The coat looked like it had never seen the inside of a real hospital. It was a costume. Chloe rushed to the front door and threw it open with a massive artificial smile. She hugged the man and whispered something in his ear before leading him into my living room. Darius followed closely behind them, looking down at his expensive leather shoes. Chloe turned to me and spoke in that sickeningly sweet, high-pitched voice she reserved for treating me like a toddler. She announced that she had brought a very special medical expert to the house to check on my failing health. She introduced the man as Dr. Trent. She claimed he was a highly respected neurologist from a prestigious private clinic across the city. She said he was doing them a massive favor by making a special house call on a Sunday afternoon. I did not say anything at first. I just stared at the shiny gold watch on Trent's wrist and the arrogant smirk resting on his face. I knew exactly who this man was. He was not a respected neurologist. He was Chloe's cousin from her mother's side. I remembered him from their lavish wedding 3 years ago. He had gotten blackout drunk and made a complete fool of himself near the open bar. Now he was standing in my living room pretending to be a brilliant medical professional. Trent approached my armchair with a clipboard in his hand. He looked down at me with absolute condescension. He did not introduce himself with any professional medical credentials. He just leaned in close and asked me how I was feeling today using a slow and loud voice as if I were completely deaf and entirely stupid. I let my hands tremble as I placed the newspaper on the coffee table. I looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. I played the part of the broken, senile old man flawlessly. I mumbled that my head felt a little cloudy and that the house felt strange to me lately. Chloe stood behind Trent and crossed her arms over her chest. I could see the absolute joy radiating from her face. She honestly believed her psychological torture had completely shattered my mind. Trent clicked his expensive pen and started asking me a series of incredibly insulting questions. He asked me to tell him my full name. He asked me to name the current president of the United States. He held up 3 fingers and asked me to count them out loud. Every single question was designed to humiliate me and establish a false baseline of severe cognitive decline. I did not break character for a single second. I stammered and stuttered over my own name. I told him the current year was 1998. I looked around the room with frantic, desperate eyes and asked where my wife Vivian had gone. I pretended I had completely forgotten that the love of my life had passed away 5 years ago. That was the hardest part of the entire performance. Using Vivian's sacred memory to feed their wicked conspiracy felt like a betrayal to my own heart. But I knew I had to give them exactly what they wanted to see. I had to let them build their mountain of lies so high that the fall would completely destroy them. Darius stood in the corner of the living room the entire time. My only son watched a fake doctor interrogate his father and did not intervene to stop it. He watched me pretend to search for his dead mother, and he just looked away in cowardly shame. He was pathetic. He had completely surrendered his manhood and his morality to a woman who viewed us both as nothing more than walking bank accounts. Trent continued his theatrical evaluation. He asked me to draw the face of a clock on a blank piece of paper. I took the pen with shaking hands and drew a jagged, sloppy circle. I scribbled random numbers outside the lines and handed the paper back to him. Trent looked at the paper and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He turned to Chloe and Darius and shook his head with a look of fake medical tragedy. He told them that my condition was deteriorating much faster than they had originally anticipated. He used a lot of complex medical terminology that he had clearly memorized from the internet just hours before arriving. He talked about advanced neurological decay and severe vascular dementia. He claimed that I was an immediate physical danger to myself and to the people living inside my house. He stated with absolute certainty that I could no longer make any rational decisions regarding my health or my financial assets. I sat in my armchair and stared blankly at the television screen playing the part of an empty shell. But inside my mind, I was carefully cataloging every single word they spoke. They were sealing their own criminal fates right in front of me. Trent reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official-looking legal documents. He placed them on my coffee table. He told Darius and Chloe that this was a preliminary medical affidavit of severe cognitive decline. He explained that once he signed this document, they could easily take it to a judge and obtain emergency legal guardianship over my entire estate. He said the document would grant them absolute control over my bank accounts, my properties, and my medical care. Darius looked at the papers and swallowed hard. He asked Trent if the judge would require any further medical testing or hospital visits to confirm the diagnosis. Trent laughed a cold, arrogant laugh. He assured my son that his signature carried enough weight in the medical community to bypass any tedious secondary evaluations. He was lying through his teeth, but Darius was too desperate and too stupid to realize it. Chloe urged Trent to sign the papers immediately. She said they could not afford to waste another single day living in danger. Trent pulled out his expensive pen and signed his name at the bottom of the fraudulent medical affidavit. He stamped the paper with an official-looking seal. He handed the documents directly to Chloe. She snatched the papers with greedy, trembling hands. She looked at the fake medical evaluation like it was a winning lottery ticket. Her eyes were practically glowing with pure evil triumph. She thanked Trent profusely and told him he was an absolute lifesaver. She said she did not know what they would ever do without his brilliant medical expertise. Trent smiled a greasy, arrogant smile and told her it was his absolute pleasure to help the family in their time of desperate need. Trent packed up his briefcase and told them he had to get back to his clinic. Chloe offered to walk him out to his car. Darius stayed in the living room pacing back and forth nervously. I continued to stare blankly at the wall, letting my jaw hang open slightly. Chloe and Trent walked out the front door and stepped onto my porch. They closed the heavy wooden door behind them, believing they were completely alone. They thought the senile old man inside could not possibly hear or see them. But they completely forgot about the high-definition micro camera I had installed directly inside the porch light fixture just 2 days ago. Later that evening, after Chloe and Darius had gone into the guest room to celebrate their false victory, I walked quietly out to my detached garage. I locked the heavy wooden door and opened my metal tool chest. I pulled out my secure tablet and accessed the encrypted surveillance application. I pulled up the recorded footage from the front porch. The audio and video quality was absolutely flawless. I watched Chloe and Trent standing on my porch in the bright afternoon sunlight. The fake doctor routine completely vanished the second the door clicked shut. Trent lit a cigarette and leaned against the wooden railing. He looked at Chloe and asked her when he was going to get paid for his little acting performance. Chloe laughed a sharp, wicked laugh. She told him to calm down and just wait for the ink to dry on the transfer papers. She looked him dead in the eyes and told him to just sign whatever papers they needed moving forward. She explicitly stated that the old guy was absolutely loaded with cash and equity. She promised Trent she would give him a clean 10% cut of the entire estate once they locked me away in a state-run facility and liquidated my assets. I sat in the dark garage and watched the footage 3 times in a row. I listened to my daughter-in-law negotiate the price of my life with a fake doctor. It was the absolute undeniable proof of felony conspiracy and medical fraud that I needed. I did not waste a single second. I opened my secure email application and attached the high-definition video file. I typed a brief message to my corporate attorney, Jada. I told her the trap was officially set and the rats were eagerly eating the poison. I hit send and watched the digital file fly through the encrypted servers straight to her law firm. The fake medical diagnosis was supposed to be their ultimate weapon against me. Instead, it became the exact rope they would use to hang themselves. With the fraudulent medical document now resting safely in their greedy hands, the entire atmosphere inside my home shifted into something dark and suffocating. Chloe and Darius no longer bothered to hide their whispers when I walked into the room. They walked across my hardwood floors with the heavy, arrogant footsteps of conquerors who had just claimed a new territory. They honestly believed the fake diagnosis gave them absolute supreme authority over my life. They thought I was officially a ghost haunting my own hallways. Their very next move was to cut all my lifelines to the outside world. They needed to make sure the confused old man could not accidentally expose their criminal conspiracy to anyone who might actually listen. The isolation tactic began on a Thursday morning. Every Thursday for the past 8 years, a kind, hard-working woman named Maria came to my house to help with the deep cleaning. Maria was a good soul who used to sit and drink sweet tea with my late wife Vivian. She knew my family history. She knew my habits. Most importantly, she knew that my mind was as sharp as a steel blade. When Maria rang the front doorbell that morning, I was sitting in my armchair playing my part. I let my chin rest on my chest and stared blankly at the floorboards. Chloe marched straight to the front door and pulled it open. I listened carefully to the exchange. Chloe did not even let Maria step inside the house. She stood blocking the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest. She spoke to Maria in a cold, dismissive tone that made my blood boil. She told the poor woman that her cleaning services were being terminated effective immediately. Maria was completely taken aback. She asked to speak to me directly. She said she wanted to check on Mr. Terry because we had a long-standing friendship. Chloe laughed a cruel, mocking laugh. She told Maria that my mental condition had deteriorated severely over the past few days. She claimed I was suffering from aggressive dementia and could no longer recognize familiar faces. Maria tried to look past Chloe's shoulder to see me sitting in the living room. I felt her worried eyes searching for mine. It took every single ounce of my willpower not to stand up and throw Chloe out into the street. But I knew I had to protect the trap I had set. I kept my head down and let my hands tremble in my lap. I stared at nothing. I played the broken old fool. I heard Maria let out a soft, heartbreaking sob. Chloe slammed the heavy wooden door shut and locked the deadbolt. My only regular visitor was gone forever. Later that same afternoon, they came for my digital lifelines. I was sitting at the kitchen table nursing a cup of cold coffee when I heard a sharp snapping sound coming from the living room. I walked out and saw Chloe pulling the main landline cord directly out of the wall jack. She bundled the white wires together and shoved the home phone into a cardboard box. She did not even try to offer me an explanation. She just walked right past me, carrying the box to the garage. 5 minutes later, Darius walked into the kitchen. He approached me with a sickening look of fake parental concern on his face. He sat down in the chair next to mine and placed his hands flat on the wooden table. He spoke to me in a soft, patronizing voice like he was talking to a confused toddler. He told me that my memory problems were starting to become a serious safety hazard. He claimed I had been making strange phone calls in the middle of the night. He completely fabricated a story about me calling random numbers and giving my personal information to dangerous scammers over the phone. He extended his hand, palm facing up, and asked me to hand over my smartphone. He said it was strictly for my own protection. He promised he would buy me a simple emergency button later in the week. He said he just wanted to make sure I did not accidentally drain my bank accounts or invite strangers to the house. The irony of his words was absolutely staggering. My own son was actively planning to steal every single penny I owned while lecturing me about imaginary financial scammers. I looked at his outstretched hand. I looked at the expensive gold watch wrapped around his wrist. I wanted to grab him by the collar and shake him until he remembered the man who raised him. But a master mechanic never forces a broken gear. A master mechanic lets the machine expose its own flaws. I reached into my pocket with a shaking hand. I pulled out my sleek black smartphone and placed it slowly into his palm. I let my lower lip quiver slightly. I mumbled a weak apology and told him I just wanted to be safe. Darius patted my shoulder with a repulsive fake tenderness. He slipped my phone into his pocket and told me not to worry about a single thing. He said he and Chloe were going to handle absolutely everything from now on. By nightfall, the physical isolation was entirely complete. They took the spare house keys from the brass hook by the door. They locked the deadbolts and slipped the keys into their own pockets. I was effectively a prisoner inside the very house I paid for with 40 years of backbreaking labor. I was completely cut off from the outside world. No friends could visit, no phone calls could come in, no messages could go out. Chloe and Darius sat in the living room watching television and drinking my expensive bourbon. They laughed loudly and talked freely about their future plans. They felt totally invincible. They thought they had successfully trapped a blind, toothless lion inside a cage. They had absolutely no idea that the lion was the one holding the key to the cage the entire time. When the house finally went completely dark and quiet, I stood up from my bed. I did not turn on the bedroom light. I navigated the dark hallway using only my memory. I walked into the small spare room at the back of the house. This was the room where Vivian used to spend her weekends sewing beautiful quilts and repairing my torn work shirts. The room still smelled faintly of her sweet lavender perfume and the metallic scent of sewing machine oil. Sitting in the corner of the room was Vivian's heavy cast-iron Singer sewing machine. It was a beautiful antique machine from the 1950s. Chloe had tried to throw it away during her first week here, but I had rescued it from the garbage bags. They thought it was just a useless, heavy piece of metal collecting dust. They did not know that a master mechanic knows every single hidden cavity inside a piece of machinery. I ran my hands over the cold, smooth metal of the sewing machine. I reached under the heavy base and found the small hidden release latch. I pressed the metal lever and a concealed compartment slid open silently in the darkness. Resting inside the dusty compartment was a fully charged prepaid burner phone. I had purchased the device with untraceable cash weeks ago when I first realized they were going to try to cut my communications. I knew exactly how greedy minds worked. I knew isolation was always their very first major offensive move. I pulled the small black device from the compartment and turned it on. The screen glowed with a faint blue light illuminating my calloused hands. I opened the encrypted messaging application and typed a quick detailed update to my corporate attorney, Jada. I informed her that the landline was completely disconnected and my primary cellular device was confiscated. I told her that the house was physically locked down and my daily visitors were turned away at the door. I confirmed that the enemy was feeling absolutely confident and entirely secure in their false victory. Jada replied less than a minute later. Her message was short, sharp, and perfectly professional. She confirmed that the blind trust was fully operational and the poison pill clause was completely armed. She stated that her private security team was monitoring the perimeter of my neighborhood and the police captain was fully briefed on the impending extortion attempt. She asked me if I was physically safe and if I wanted them to breach the house and extract me immediately. I stared at the glowing blue screen in the pitch-black room. I could hear Darius snoring loudly down the hallway. I could hear the heavy silence of a house that had been stolen from its rightful owner. I typed my response with steady, deliberate thumbs. I told Jada to hold the line and stand down. I told her I was not in any immediate physical danger. I explained that I was a prisoner by my own deliberate choice. I knew their desperation was growing by the hour. I had seen the threatening letters from the ruthless loan sharks. I knew those dangerous men were not going to wait much longer for their $250,000. Darius was completely out of time and out of options. He could not wait for a lengthy legal process to declare me incompetent. He could not wait for a judge to grant him official control over my assets. He needed liquid cash immediately, or his life was completely over. I knew this intense physical isolation was just the final step before their ultimate desperate demand. They locked me inside this house to break my spirit and force my hand. They were going to try to force me to sign the property transfer papers under extreme duress. They were going to corner me in my own study and demand my signature. I needed to be right here waiting for them when they finally made their fatal move. I turned off the burner phone and slipped it back into the secret metal compartment of the antique sewing machine. I locked the latch silently and walked back to my bedroom. I lay down on my mattress and stared up at the dark ceiling. I listened to the quiet breathing of the house. I was entirely cut off from the world. My son thought he had completely defeated me. He thought he was the ultimate predator stalking a weak-old victim. He was about to find out that he was nothing more than a foolish mouse walking directly into a steel trap armed with $12 million of pure explosive justice. I closed my eyes and went to sleep feeling perfectly calm. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all I had to do was wait for the trap to snap shut. The heavy silence of my isolated house was completely shattered at exactly 2 a.m. I was lying awake in my dark bedroom staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant sounds of the city. Suddenly a massive crash echoed from the front living room. The violent sound of heavy glass shattering into 1,000 pieces tore through the quiet night. I did not jump out of bed in a panic. I sat up slowly and put on my leather slippers. I walked down the dark hallway with steady, measured steps. I was a man who had faced down violent men in my youth, and a broken window was not going to make my heart race. When I reached the living room, Darius was already there. He was standing barefoot on the hardwood floor, shivering uncontrollably. The large front window was completely destroyed. Cold night air blew into the house, carrying the distant sound of tires screeching away down the empty street. Lying right in the center of Vivian's vintage rug was a solid red clay brick. Tied around the brick with thick black electrical tape was a crumpled piece of white paper. Darius dropped to his knees as if all the strength had been drained from his bones. He reached out with trembling hands and ripped the tape off the brick. He unfolded the paper and read the message written inside. I watched the remaining blood drain completely from his face. His knees buckled and he slumped back against the sofa. He looked like a man who had just read his own execution order. Chloe came running down the stairs, pulling a silk robe tight around her body. She saw the broken glass and the brick resting on the floor. She snatched the paper from her husband's hands. Her pale face turned a sickly shade of gray. The ruthless loan sharks were completely out of patience. They were no longer sending polite warnings through the mail. They were delivering promises of violence directly into our living room. Darius looked up at me, standing quietly in the hallway shadows. The fake confidence and the arrogant demands he had been displaying for weeks were entirely gone. He scrambled to his feet, crunching broken glass under his bare heels. He did not even feel the pain slicing into his skin. He rushed over to me and grabbed my shoulders. His breath smelled of stale alcohol and pure, unadulterated panic. He begged me to listen to him. He said his life was in absolute danger and that men were coming to hurt him. He pleaded with me to sign the house over to him right now this very morning. He claimed he needed the equity immediately or he was going to lose absolutely everything, including his life. I looked deeply into the eyes of the boy I had raised. I saw the deep dark circles under his eyes. I saw the pathetic weakness that had consumed his soul. I knew exactly how much he owed, and I knew exactly who he owed it to. I had $12 million sitting safely in a blind trust managed by my ruthless corporate attorney. I could have paid off his dangerous debts with a single phone call to Jada. I could have wiped his slate clean and saved his miserable life right then and there. But a master mechanic knows you cannot fix a broken engine by pouring clean oil over a cracked engine block. You have to take the machine apart completely and find the true source of the catastrophic failure. I decided to offer my only son one final, ultimate chance at redemption. I reached up and gently removed his shaking hands from my shoulders. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with absolute clarity. I told him I would help him. I told him I would give him whatever financial support he needed to survive, but he had to do one simple thing first. I told Darius he had to look me in the eye and tell me the absolute truth about why he needed my house. I demanded that he take full accountability for whatever he had done. I promised him that if he confessed everything to me right then and there as a man, I would stand by his side and protect him from the violent storm outside. I offered him a clear path back to his father's grace. Darius opened his mouth and hesitated. I waited for the truth. I waited for him to confess the illegal sports gambling. I waited for him to admit the massive losses in foolish cryptocurrency investments. I waited for him to apologize for bringing violent criminals to my front door and putting my life at risk. Instead, he swallowed hard and looked over his shoulder at Chloe. He turned back to me and lied straight to my face. He spun a pathetic, fabricated story about a commercial real estate venture that went bankrupt because of a bad business partner. He blamed the economy. He blamed the local banks. He blamed everyone and everything except his own greedy, reckless decisions. He refused to take a single ounce of accountability for his actions. My heart turned to solid stone inside my chest. I had given him the keys to his own salvation, and he chose to throw them right back into the garbage. He was too cowardly to face his own father with the truth. He was too terrified of losing face in front of his manipulative wife. I looked at him with profound sadness and absolute finality. I shook my head slowly. I told him that I could not fund a lie. I told him my house was not going to be sacrificed to pay for his fictional business problems. I turned my back on my only son and began walking back down the hallway to my bedroom. Darius let out a desperate, pathetic sob. He tried to follow me, but Chloe stepped right in front of him. She grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and pulled him close to her face. She did not know that I had installed a high-definition micro camera right above the hallway thermostat. She did not know that my ears were still sharp enough to hear a rat scurrying inside the walls. I stopped walking and listened to her venomous whisper echoing in the cold, drafty living room. Chloe told Darius to stop begging like a pathetic loser. She told him that I was never going to willingly hand over the property to him. She reminded him that they already possessed the fake medical documents signed by her cousin Trent. She hissed that my mind was officially documented as failing, and my legal rights were basically gone. She looked at the broken glass covering the floor and told Darius they were completely out of time. She whispered that they had to force me to sign the property transfer papers today, or those violent men were going to come back and murder him. She explicitly commanded him to stop acting like a weak son and start acting like a man who wanted to survive by any means necessary. I walked into my bedroom and closed the door quietly. I did not lock it. I did not need to hide from them anymore. The final boundary had been completely crossed. My son had officially chosen his path, and it was a path that led straight to his own destruction. He had rejected my offer of grace and embraced the poison his wife was feeding him. They were going to try to force my hand today. They were going to corner me and use the threat of violence to extract my signature. They thought they were holding a winning hand because they had a fake medical diagnosis and a desperate deadline. I walked over to the antique sewing machine in the spare room. I opened the hidden compartment and pulled out my prepaid burner phone. I sent a single encrypted message to Jada. I told my lawyer that the enemy was advancing to the final stage of their plan. I confirmed that the physical threat was imminent, and they were preparing the fraudulent transfer documents right now. I told her to place the private security team on high alert and prepare the police captain for the extortion trap. I placed the phone back into its hiding spot and walked to my window. I watched the sun begin to rise over my beloved city. Today was the day my son would try to break me. Today was the day he would learn what happens when you mistake a father's patience for weakness. I knew their desperation had reached its absolute boiling point. Desperate rats will chew through solid concrete to escape a sinking ship. I needed to give them a very specific piece of cheese to guide them directly into my steel trap. After the brick shattered our living room window, I retreated to my bedroom and waited for the morning sun to rise. I listened to them cleaning up the broken glass in total silence. I knew they were terrified. I knew they were running completely out of time. I put on my old work boots and walked out to the kitchen. I told them I was feeling incredibly weak and my heart was fluttering again. I said I was going to lie down in my room for the rest of the afternoon and absolutely did not want to be disturbed. I locked my bedroom door very loudly to make sure they heard the heavy deadbolt click into place. But I did not go to sleep. I opened my closet and accessed the hidden compartment containing my secure tablet. I sat on the edge of my mattress and watched the live feed from the micro camera hidden inside the smoke detector in my private study. My study was the one room in the house they had not yet dared to invade. I always kept the heavy oak door locked with an old brass key. But that morning I deliberately left the key resting on the kitchen counter right next to my coffee mug. It was an invitation they simply could not resist. I watched the high-definition video feed on my glowing screen. Less than 20 minutes after I locked my bedroom door, Darius and Chloe crept down the hallway. Darius was holding my brass key in his shaking hand. He looked over his shoulder toward my bedroom, terrified that I might suddenly walk out. Chloe pushed past him and shoved the key into the lock. She twisted it roughly and pushed the heavy oak door open. They stepped inside my private sanctuary. This was the room where Vivian and I used to sit and talk about our future. This was the room where I kept my old mechanic manuals and my private files. Chloe immediately began tearing through my personal belongings like a starving scavenger. She opened desk drawers and tossed my old paperwork onto the floor. She had absolutely no respect for the boundaries of my home. Darius stood near the doorway acting as a pathetic lookout. He whispered that they should not be doing this and that I would definitely notice my things were moved. Chloe completely ignored him. She was a woman possessed by pure, unchecked greed. She pulled out the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. I had deliberately left a thick manila envelope resting right on top of my old tax returns. It was labeled in bold black ink as my last will and testament. It was not my real will. My real documents were locked safely inside a fireproof vault in a towering glass skyscraper downtown. This document was a brilliant decoy created by my corporate attorney Jada specifically for this very moment. It was legally binding in its appearance but utterly useless in reality because of the poison pill clause we had already established. Chloe snatched the manila envelope and ripped it open. She pulled out the thick stack of crisp legal papers. I watched her pale eyes scan the first page. At first she just looked annoyed, but as she flipped to the second page containing the schedule of assets, her entire physical demeanor changed entirely. Her eyes widened so much I thought they might pop out of her skull. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She literally started to hyperventilate. She dropped to her knees right there on the woven rug and stared at the numbers printed on the white paper. Darius rushed over to her thinking she was having a panic attack. He grabbed her shoulders and asked her what was wrong. Chloe could not even form a complete sentence. She just shoved the legal documents directly into his chest. Darius looked down at the papers. I watched my son's face transform from absolute terror to complete and utter disbelief. He read the exact locations of the 3 massive commercial shopping plazas I owned in downtown Atlanta. He read the total balance of my secret investment accounts. He read the final calculated net worth printed clearly at the bottom of the page. $12 million. My son fell backward and slumped against the wooden bookshelf. He kept repeating the number over and over again under his breath as if it were a magical spell. $12 million. The amount was so massive it completely shattered their reality. They thought they were fighting over a modest brick house worth maybe $500,000. They thought I was a poor retired mechanic living on a fixed income. They suddenly realized they were standing inside the home of a quiet, invisible millionaire. They realized the man they had been tormenting and gaslighting was sitting on a fortune that could buy and sell their entire existence 20 times over. Chloe scrambled to her feet. The pure evil greed radiating from her body was almost visible through the camera feed. She started laughing hysterically, pacing back and forth across my study. She told Darius that their massive debt was absolutely nothing compared to this fortune. She said they could pay off the violent loan sharks today and still live like absolute royalty for the rest of their natural lives. She was already spending my money in her mind. She was already planning the luxury vacations and the designer wardrobes. She looked at the decoy will as if it were a golden ticket handed directly to her from heaven. But then the harsh, cold reality of the legal system suddenly hit her. She stopped pacing abruptly. She looked at the document again and her greedy smile instantly vanished. She turned to Darius and her voice dropped to a sinister, vicious whisper. She told him that this was a last will and testament. She stated that a will only pays out when the person who wrote it is actually dead. Darius swallowed hard and looked toward the hallway where my bedroom was located. The silence in the study was incredibly heavy. I watched my son process the dark implication of her words. Chloe began pacing again, her mind working at a furious criminal pace. She said they could not possibly wait for me to die naturally. She said the ruthless loan sharks who threw the brick through the window were going to murder Darius tonight if they did not get their money. She stated that even if I had a fatal heart attack today, the probate courts would freeze the assets for months. The legal process would drag on and they would be left with absolutely nothing while the lawyers sorted it out. They needed liquid cash immediately. They needed absolute legal control right now. Chloe looked Darius dead in the eye. She closed the physical distance between them and grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. She told him they needed to force me to sign a living deed of transfer today, bypassing the probate courts entirely. She said they had to make me sign everything over to them while I was still breathing. Darius looked terrified. He stammered and told her that I would never willingly sign a document like that. He reminded her how stubbornly I had refused the reverse mortgage just a few days prior. Chloe slapped his chest hard. She told him he had to stop acting like a frightened child. She said they had the fake medical affidavit signed by her cousin Trent. She claimed that document gave them the ultimate leverage. She told my son that they were going to draft a master transfer deed right now. She said they would corner me in this very study, and they would not let me leave the room until I signed away my entire $12 million empire. She whispered venomously to Darius, telling him he had to choose between his old father and his own life. She reminded him of the brick and the shattered glass. She said he had a licensed weapon, and he needed to start acting like a man who wanted to survive. Darius looked down at his trembling hands. The blinding allure of $12 million completely erased whatever tiny shred of morality he had left. He nodded his head slowly and agreed to the violent extortion plan. He agreed to threaten the life of the man who gave him everything. I sat on my bed in the dark room. The profound sadness of watching my son agree to extort me with the threat of violence was incredibly heavy. But my resolve was completely unbreakable. I had given him every opportunity to come clean. I had offered him a path to redemption. He chose the path of the criminal. I reached into the hidden compartment of the antique sewing machine and pulled out my encrypted burner phone. The screen illuminated my calloused hands in the dim light of the spare room. I opened the messaging application and typed a quick, decisive message to my ruthless corporate attorney, Jada. I kept the message short and completely professional. I told her the bait was taken and the trap was perfectly set. I informed her that they had discovered the decoy will and were drafting the fraudulent living deed of transfer as we spoke. I confirmed that they were making their final aggressive move tonight. I instructed her to arm the poison pill protocol and have the private security team and the local police captain on standby immediately outside my property line. I hit send and watched the message fly through the digital ether. Jada replied within 30 seconds, confirming that all units were in position and the legal snare was primed. I placed the phone back into its hiding spot and secured the latch. I stood up from my bed and smoothed the wrinkles out of my shirt. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. I was not a victim. I was a man defending his castle. I walked out into the hallway and prepared to face the storm. I was completely ready to watch them destroy themselves. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway struck exactly 8 times. The deep chiming echoed through the deadly silent house. It was a Tuesday evening, but it felt like the very end of the world. I was sitting quietly in my private study, surrounded by the dark oak walls and the smell of old leather and polished wood. Outside my closed door, the tension in the house was so thick it was almost suffocating. I did not need to see through the walls to know exactly what was happening in the living room. I had been monitoring them through the hidden cameras all afternoon. Darius was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. He was walking like a condemned man, counting his final steps to the gallows. He was drinking heavily. I watched him pour his 4th glass of my most expensive bourbon. His hands were shaking so violently that the amber liquid spilled over the edges of the crystal glass and stained the wooden table. He was terrified. The violent men he owed money to were closing in on him, and he knew he was completely out of time. He was trying to drown his cowardice in alcohol, but the liquor was only fueling his erratic desperation. Sitting right across from him at the dining table was Chloe. She was entirely unaffected by the looming threat of physical violence. She was fueled by pure, unadulterated greed. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers flying across the keyboard of her sleek silver laptop. She was frantically drafting the final fraudulent transfer papers. She was typing up a living deed of transfer that would strip me of my $12 million commercial real estate empire and place it directly into her greedy hands. She occasionally stopped typing just long enough to snap at Darius, telling him to stop pacing and start acting like a man. She was meticulously preparing the weapon they would use to execute my financial ruin. I sat perfectly still behind my heavy wooden desk. I was not afraid. I was not panicking. I was a man who had already secured his fortress and was simply waiting for the enemy to breach the outer gates. But sitting there in the dim light of my desk lamp, I felt a profound, crushing sorrow settling deep into my bones. This was not the way a father's story is supposed to end. A father is supposed to leave his legacy to a son who will honor it and grow it and pass it down to the next generation. I had spent 40 years breaking my back in the freezing rain and the scorching heat of Atlanta just to build an empire for my bloodline. And now that very same bloodline was preparing to walk through my door and extort me with the threat of violence. I looked down at the polished surface of my desk. Resting right next to my brass pen holder was a silver-framed photograph of my beautiful late wife, Vivian. The picture was taken on our 30th wedding anniversary. She was smiling so brightly, wearing a vibrant yellow dress that perfectly complemented her dark skin. She looked so proud and so full of unconditional love. We had stood together in the very living room where her son was now pacing and plotting my destruction. We had promised each other that we would always protect our family no matter the cost. I reached out with my rough, calloused hand and gently traced the edge of the silver frame. I felt a single hot tear roll down my weathered cheek. It was the only tear I would allow myself to shed tonight. I looked at Vivian's beautiful, smiling face, and I made a silent apology to her spirit. I apologized for what I was about to do to the boy we created together. I apologized that our son had turned out to be a weak, greedy coward who valued money over his own father's life. I picked up the silver frame very carefully. I could not bear the thought of her watching this final, horrific betrayal. I could not let her sacred memory bear witness to the monster her son had become. I slowly placed the photograph face down on the cool wooden surface of the desk. I smoothed my hand over the back of the frame one last time. I told her spirit to rest easy and let me handle the storm that was coming. Once the photograph was safely hidden away, I turned my attention to the final mechanical preparations of my trap. I reached deep under the heavy wooden overhang of my desk. I ran my fingers along the smooth underside until I felt the small hidden metal toggle switch. I pressed the switch firmly. A tiny invisible green light blinked on, indicating that the high-definition recording device mounted perfectly flush under my desk was fully operational. The device was wired directly into a secure cloud server managed by my corporate attorney, Jada. Every single sound, every single movement, and every single threat uttered inside this room from this moment forward would be permanently recorded and securely stored as absolute, irrefutable legal evidence of felony extortion. I folded my hands together and rested them on top of my desk. I slowed my breathing until it was perfectly steady and deep. I cleared my mind of all sorrow and all hesitation. I was no longer a grieving father mourning the loss of his only child. I was a master mechanic waiting for a broken, toxic machine to finally tear itself apart. The heavy silence of the house was suddenly broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. I heard them moving down the long wooden hallway. Chloe's footsteps were sharp and quick, clicking against the floorboards with absolute predatory determination. Darius had a heavy, dragging step, the erratic, clumsy walk of a man who was completely intoxicated and consumed by sheer terror. They stopped right outside my closed study door. I heard Chloe whisper a harsh, vicious command to him. She told him to pull himself together and get this over with right now. I did not move a single muscle. I just watched the brass doorknob begin to turn slowly. The heavy oak door did not just open. It burst inward violently, slamming hard against the interior wall of the study. The sudden loud crash echoed through the quiet room. Darius and Chloe stepped across the threshold and walked directly into my private sanctuary. They stood side by side, but they looked like they belonged to two completely different worlds. Chloe stepped forward first, holding a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents in her pale hands. Her face was set in a cold, ruthless mask of pure, unadulterated ambition. She was wearing a sharp, dark blazer, looking exactly like a corporate raider arriving to liquidate a bankrupt company. She looked at me with eyes completely devoid of any human empathy. She did not see a father-in-law. She did not see a human being. She only saw a $12 million obstacle that she was finally going to remove from her path. But Darius was an entirely different story. My son looked completely and utterly unhinged. The expensive tailored clothes he usually wore with such arrogant pride were wrinkled and disheveled. The top buttons of his shirt were violently torn open. His face was a sickly pale color, completely slick with a heavy layer of cold sweat. The sweat was pouring down his forehead and stinging his bloodshot eyes. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down as if he had just sprinted a mile. He smelled strongly of fear and cheap liquor. His eyes darted frantically around the room, looking at the bookshelves, the heavy curtains, the locked windows, anywhere except directly at me. He was a man standing on the very edge of a massive psychological cliff, and the gravity of what he was about to do was pulling him straight down into the abyss. He knew he was crossing a line that could never ever be uncrossed. He knew he was about to commit an unforgivable sin against the man who gave him life. But the terror of the violent loan sharks waiting for him out in the city was greater than the love he held for his father. I remained perfectly seated behind my desk. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask them what they were doing, bursting into my study like violent criminals. I simply looked at the two of them standing there in the dim light of my office. I let the heavy, oppressive silence stretch out between us, making the tension in the room rise to an absolutely unbearable level. Chloe stepped closer to the desk, her high heels clicking loudly on the woven rug. She slammed the thick stack of fraudulent transfer papers directly onto the polished wood right in front of me. She placed a heavy black pen precisely on top of the documents. She stood tall, crossing her arms over her chest, and looked down at me with an arrogant, victorious smirk. She had absolutely no idea that she had just walked straight into a steel trap armed with explosive legal consequences. She had no idea that the silent old man sitting across from her was about to trigger an absolute avalanche of justice that would completely bury them both alive. The final battle had arrived at my desk, and I was entirely prepared to finish it. Chloe stepped right up to the edge of my heavy oak desk. She lifted the thick stack of fraudulent transfer papers and slammed them down onto the polished wood. The loud smack echoed in the quiet study, bouncing off the walls and the tall wooden bookshelves. She leaned forward, resting her pale hands flat on the desk. She looked down at me with an expression of supreme arrogance. She ordered me to sign them and told me that I was completely done. She spoke to me not as a daughter-in-law speaking to an elder, but as a cruel prison warden speaking to a defeated inmate. She told me the games were officially over, and it was time for me to surrender my assets. She pointed at the dotted line on the final page of the living deed of transfer. She placed a heavy black pen right on top of the crisp white paper. She stood there waiting for me to obey her vicious command. I looked down at the documents resting in front of me. I could see the bold black text detailing the immediate transfer of my 3 commercial shopping plazas and my entire $12 million estate directly into her control. I did not reach for the heavy black pen. I slowly laced my calloused fingers together and rested them comfortably on my lap. I looked up into her cold blue eyes. I told her no. I told her I would never sign a single page of her fraudulent demands. I kept my voice perfectly level and dangerously calm. I told Chloe that I built this incredible wealth with my own bare hands. I reminded her of the 40 years I spent waking up before dawn to freeze in the bitter Atlanta winters working on heavy diesel engines. I spoke of the toxic grease permanently stained into my fingerprints and the aching pain in my spine that never goes away. I talked about the 1980s when local banks refused to lend money to a black man trying to buy commercial real estate. I told her how I saved every single penny I earned and bought those properties outright with sheer willpower and unbreakable determination. I looked her up and down and stated a simple, undeniable fact. I told her she had not worked a single hard day in her entire pampered life. I said she was nothing but a greedy parasite trying to steal the harvest from a field she never plowed. I made it absolutely clear that my legacy would never fund her endless luxury shopping habits or her superficial lifestyle. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet to freezing. My words struck her right in her most vulnerable, insecure spot. Chloe had spent her entire adult life pretending she was superior to everyone around her, but she knew deep down she had earned absolutely nothing. Hearing the cold, hard truth from an old man she despised completely shattered her artificial composure. The sophisticated modern woman facade vanished entirely. The polite, passive-aggressive mask melted away, revealing the ugly, hateful monster hiding underneath. Chloe completely lost her temper. Her face turned a violent shade of crimson. Her neck grew blotchy and red with pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her fists against my desk again and leaned so far forward I could feel her ragged breath on my face. She unleashed a vicious tirade of pure racist and classist insults that she had been holding back for months. She told me I was just a lucky old black man who absolutely did not know his place in the world. She screamed that a man from my background had no business holding on to $12 million while people like her were struggling to maintain their lifestyle. She paced back and forth across my woven rug, screaming that I was nothing but an ignorant grease monkey who stumbled into a real estate fortune by sheer dumb luck. She claimed my entire legacy was a mistake of the system. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and yelled that Darius deserved this wealth, and more importantly, she deserved this wealth. She said she had sacrificed her prime years marrying into this family expecting a massive payout, and she was not going to leave empty-handed. She yelled that she was tired of living in the shadow of a stubborn old fool who belonged in a cheap nursing home or a graveyard. She demanded that I hand over the keys to the kingdom because she believed she was inherently entitled to rule it by virtue of her very existence. She said the money was going to be hers whether I liked it or not, and I was powerless to stop her. Every hateful word she spoke was being perfectly captured by the high-definition recording device hidden right under my desk. She was sealing her own fate with every racist slur and every vicious threat. The microphone picked up the raw venom in her voice. The camera captured the aggressive, violent posture of her body. She was providing the exact evidence my corporate attorney Jada needed to ensure she spent a very long time inside a concrete cell. I sat perfectly still, allowing her to dig her grave deeper and deeper with every breath she took. But the legal victory did not stop the profound pain slicing through my heart. It was not her insults that hurt me. It was the fact that my only son was standing right there listening to his wife degrade and humiliate his own father. I slowly turned my gaze away from the screaming woman and looked directly at Darius. The boy I had raised was standing near the heavy wooden door, completely paralyzed by fear and shame. He was sweating profusely and his hands were trembling at his sides. The smell of stale alcohol radiated from his skin. He had heard every single racist slur. He had heard his wife tell his father that a black man had no right to own commercial real estate. He had heard her reduce his family history to a lucky mistake. He had listened to the woman he married verbally destroy the man who gave him life and provided for his every need. I looked at my son. I thought about the days I spent teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the local park. I thought about the nights I sat by his bed when he had a terrible fever. I thought about the way Vivian used to look at him with such profound, unconditional love. I remembered how I broke my back working double shifts just so he could attend a prestigious private university and never have to worry about student loans. I had shielded him from the harsh realities of the world, hoping he would grow into a strong, honorable man. I asked him a simple, direct question. I kept my voice quiet, but incredibly firm. I asked Darius if he was really going to stand there and let her speak to his father like that in his own home. It was the ultimate test of a man's soul. It was his absolute last chance to find a shred of dignity and stand up for the blood running through his own veins. I waited for him to find his voice. I waited for him to tell Chloe to shut her mouth and show some basic respect. I waited for the son I loved to finally emerge from the shadows and defend his family legacy. Darius looked at me. His eyes were wide and filled with a cowardly, pathetic terror. He did not see a father asking for basic human respect. He only saw the violent loan sharks waiting for him out in the dark city. He only saw the massive mountain of illegal gambling debt that was about to crush his life into dust. He slowly turned his head and looked away from me. He stared at the blank wall, unable to meet my gaze for another second. He proved his absolute cowardice in that single silent moment. He completely surrendered his manhood and his morality to a woman who hated everything about where he came from. He swallowed hard and spoke in a weak, trembling whisper. He told me to just sign the papers. He begged me to just do what she said and sign the transfer deed so this could all be over. He said they needed the money today, and there was no other way out of this nightmare. The betrayal was absolute and final. My son had officially chosen his side. He had chosen the path of a traitor and a coward. He was willing to let his father be racially abused and financially extorted just to save his own skin. The profound sorrow I felt was instantly replaced by a freezing cold determination. The last lingering hope I held for his redemption evaporated into the cold air of the study. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I knew the time for parental grace had completely passed. The time for ruthless consequences had officially arrived. I sat behind my desk, staring at the broken man who used to be my child, entirely prepared to execute the final stage of my plan. I placed my hands completely flat on the surface of my heavy oak desk. I looked down at the fraudulent living deed of transfer resting in front of me. I looked at the thick black pen Chloe had placed perfectly in the center of the crisp white pages. I did not move my fingers toward it. I slowly extended my arms and placed my calloused fingertips against the very edge of the legal documents. With a slow and deliberate motion, I pushed the entire stack of papers back across the polished wood. The documents slid silently and stopped right in front of the pale hands of my daughter-in-law. I looked directly into the terrified, bloodshot eyes of my son, and I gave him my absolute final answer. I simply told him no. I kept my voice perfectly level and dangerously quiet. I told Darius I would rather burn every single dollar of my fortune to ash than hand my family legacy over to a coward and a greedy parasite. The rejection hit Darius like a violent physical blow to his chest. The heavy silence in the study suddenly shattered. The crushing reality of the violent loan sharks waiting for him out in the dark city finally broke his fragile mind. He began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved up and down as he gasped for air. He mumbled frantically that I did not understand what was going to happen to him tonight. He said the dangerous men from the illegal loan agency were going to murder him if he did not hand over the equity in my house. I looked at him without a single ounce of pity. I told him that his reckless gambling debts were his own burden to bear, and I would not sacrifice my home to save a man who refused to take accountability for his own miserable actions. The tension in the room snapped like a dry wooden branch. Darius let out a primal, desperate sound from the back of his throat. He reached his shaking hand behind his back and shoved his fingers into the waistband of his wrinkled trousers. He pulled out a heavy black 9mm Glock. The metallic clack of the weapon being drawn echoed loudly in the quiet study. My heart completely stopped in my chest. The boy I had protected from every single danger in the world was now aiming a deadly, licensed firearm directly at me. He did not just point it at my chest from across the room. He walked violently around the edge of my heavy oak desk. He stepped right into my personal space, crossing the ultimate boundary between a father and a son. He raised the heavy gun and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against my right temple. The metal was freezing cold against my aging skin. For a fraction of a second, the sheer heartbreak threatened to completely paralyze me. This was the exact same boy I used to carry on my broad shoulders through the crowded streets of downtown Atlanta. This was the same boy I sat up with all night long when he suffered from terrible fevers as a child. I had worked 40 grueling years covered in toxic engine grease and hydraulic fluid just to buy him a safe and privileged life. I had shattered my own spine lifting heavy machinery so he would never have to know what true physical labor felt like. And now my ultimate reward was the cold, dark barrel of a loaded gun pressed firmly against my skull by his shaking, sweating hand. I felt a profound, crushing sorrow rip through my soul. My blood ran completely cold as I realized the child I loved was entirely dead and gone. But a master mechanic never panics when a heavy machine violently misfires. A master mechanic immediately diagnoses the catastrophic failure and executes the necessary emergency protocol. My sorrow instantly evaporated and was completely replaced by absolute, calculated precision. I did not flinch away from the weapon. I did not beg for my life. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair and allowed the cold logic of my survival plan to take total control of my mind. I shifted my gaze slightly toward the center of the room. I fully expected Chloe to scream in terror. I expected her to rush forward and pull her desperate husband back from the brink of a massive felony, but she did nothing of the sort. Chloe stood perfectly still, watching her husband hold a loaded weapon to the head of his own father. Her face did not show a single ounce of fear or moral remorse. Her pale blue eyes were glowing with a sick, twisted thrill. She crossed her arms over her chest and she actually began to smile. She looked at me sitting there with a deadly weapon resting against my temple, and she let out a sharp, piercing laugh. The sound was incredibly evil and completely devoid of any basic human empathy. The cruel laugh bounced off the walls of my study, mocking the decades of love and sacrifice I had poured into this family. She stepped closer to the desk and looked down at me with absolute supreme arrogance. She told me to just sign the papers, Terry. She said I was far too old to manage this kind of wealth anyway. She spoke the words with such casual viciousness that it made my stomach churn. She honestly believed that armed violence was a perfectly acceptable tool to acquire wealth she had absolutely never earned. She viewed my life as nothing more than a temporary obstacle blocking her path to a life of endless luxury. Darius pressed the steel barrel harder against my skin. His hand was shaking so badly I honestly thought the weapon might discharge by pure nervous accident. He yelled at me to just sign the documents and make this terrible nightmare end. He pleaded with me, saying he had absolutely no other choice. I slowly lowered my gaze back to the polished oak desk. I reached out with my steady, calloused hand and picked up the heavy black pen. I pulled the fraudulent living deed of transfer back across the wood until it rested right in front of me. I looked at the dotted line waiting empty at the very bottom of the final page. I knew exactly what this signature meant to the two criminals standing in my study. To them, it meant absolute supreme victory. To them, it meant the immediate transfer of my 3 commercial shopping plazas and my entire $12 million estate directly into their greedy hands. They thought this ink would buy them mansions and designer clothes and a lifetime of unearned royal status. But I also knew exactly what this signature meant to me and to my ruthless corporate attorney, Jada. It meant the immediate automatic activation of the most aggressive legal trap her law firm had ever designed. It meant the absolute detonation of the poison pill clause. I pressed the tip of the gold pen against the crisp white paper. I smoothly signed my full legal name, Terrence Jenkins, exactly as I had done 1,000,000 times before on countless business contracts. The very second the ink dried on the page, Chloe lunged forward like a starving animal. She snatched the entire stack of legal documents right out from under my resting hand. She clutched the papers tightly against her chest as if she had just stolen the crown jewels of an empire. She let out another loud, triumphant laugh that filled the room. She looked at Darius with pure manic joy and cheered, declaring that now absolutely everything was theirs. She danced a little step of pure, greedy victory right there on my woven vintage rug. Darius let out a massive, ragged sigh of profound relief. He slowly lowered the 9mm Glock and took a heavy, trembling step back from my leather chair. He ran his shaking hand over his sweaty face, truly believing he had just saved his own miserable life from the violent loan sharks. He looked at the freshly signed papers secured in the hands of his wife, and he smiled a weak, pathetic smile. They honestly thought they had completely conquered me. They thought the brutal battle was officially over and they had emerged as the absolute untouchable victors. They thought they were walking out of my private study as multimillionaires ready to conquer the city of Atlanta. They did not notice me slowly lowering my right hand beneath the heavy wooden overhang of my oak desk. I slid my rough fingers along the smooth, dark underside of the wood until I felt the small, raised plastic surface of the silent panic button. This was not a standard residential home security button. This sophisticated device was wired directly into the encrypted digital servers at Jadis' high-powered corporate law firm. It was linked simultaneously to the emergency dispatch center at the local police precinct just 2 miles down the road. Pressing this hidden button meant the poison pill protocol was fully and irreversibly executing. It meant my entire $12 million estate was instantly locked down into an impenetrable blind trust that no forged signature could ever breach. It meant the banks were immediately freezing every single asset and blocking all possible property transfers. Most importantly, it meant the police were receiving an immediate verified emergency alert reporting an active hostage situation and an armed felony extortion in progress at my exact address. I looked up at the two of them celebrating their violently stolen fortune right in the middle of my private sanctuary. I looked at my only son who had tragically traded his very soul and the life of his father for a stack of paper that was already legally null and void. I pressed my thumb extremely hard against the silent panic button. I felt the small mechanical click beneath the plastic surface confirming the signal was sent. The silent digital alert flew out of my house into the dark Atlanta night, calling down an absolute storm of violent justice they could never possibly outrun or manipulate. I folded my hands back onto the top of my desk and waited in complete, total silence for the beautiful, chaotic symphony of police sirens to finally begin. The heavy silence in the study was absolute. Chloe was still clutching the forged documents against her chest. She was breathing heavily with pure, greedy excitement. Darius was wiping the thick sweat from his forehead. He believed he had just saved his own miserable life. He believed the violent men waiting in the dark city would finally leave him alone. They both stood there, bathed in the warm yellow glow of my desk lamp. They had absolutely no idea that a massive digital signal was currently racing through the encrypted servers downtown. I sat perfectly still behind my heavy oak desk. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not give them a single clue. I did not smile. I did not frown. I just waited. 10 seconds passed. Then 20 seconds passed. Then the beautiful sound began. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the far distance. It was the sound of heavy police cruisers accelerating down the quiet suburban streets of Atlanta. The sound grew louder and more aggressive with every passing second. Darius froze. His head snapped toward the heavy velvet curtains covering my study window. He swallowed hard. The wailing sound multiplied. It was not just one single police cruiser. It was an entire fleet of emergency vehicles converging directly on my specific address. The flashing lights hit the house first. Bright beams of intense red and piercing blue light slashed straight through the narrow gaps in the window blinds. The violent colors danced across the dark oak walls of my private sanctuary. They illuminated the sheer terror spreading across my son's sweaty face. The flashing lights painted Chloe's pale skin with alternating flashes of crimson and sapphire. Her victorious, greedy smile instantly vanished. The thick stack of fraudulent transfer papers suddenly looked very heavy in her trembling hands. The heavy police sirens reached a deafening roar right outside my front lawn. Car doors slammed violently against metal frames. Heavy boots hit the concrete pavement of my driveway. Darius went into a state of absolute mindless panic. He looked down at the 9mm Glock still resting in his shaking hand. He realized he was holding a deadly weapon inside a house that was suddenly surrounded by an army of armed police officers. He scrambled backwards, stumbling over the edge of the woven rug. He shoved the cold steel barrel of the gun deep into the waistband of his wrinkled trousers. He pulled his untucked shirt down, trying desperately to conceal the illegal firearm. He was breathing so fast I thought his heart might literally explode inside his chest. Chloe grabbed his arm with a vicious grip. She pulled him close and hissed a sharp command into his face. She told him to act perfectly natural. She told him to calm down and stop sweating like a guilty criminal. She said I was just a confused old man suffering from severe dementia. She reminded Darius that they possessed the official medical affidavit signed by her cousin Trent. She stated with absolute supreme arrogance that the police would automatically believe her over me. She firmly believed that a team of law enforcement officers would always take the word of a young, tearful white woman over the frantic claims of an elderly black man. She adjusted her dark blazer and smoothed her hair, preparing to play the role of the innocent, concerned daughter-in-law. She completely believed her own toxic lies. She thought her fake medical papers were an impenetrable magical shield. I watched her construct her pathetic defense strategy in real time. She did not know that the police were not responding to a simple wellness check. They were responding to an active, verified hostage situation and a felony armed extortion triggered directly by a high-powered corporate law firm. The heavy wooden front door of my house did not simply open. It was violently kicked inward by absolute brute physical force. The loud wooden crunch of the door frame splintering apart echoed down the hallway. I heard the thunderous sound of a dozen heavy tactical boots swarming into my living room. Loud, authoritative voices echoed through the house demanding absolute compliance. Men were shouting commands and securing the perimeter of the property. Chloe took a deep breath and pasted a look of profound, innocent tragedy onto her face. She turned toward the open study door, ready to deliver the greatest acting performance of her miserable life. She opened her mouth to speak. She was preparing to tell the officers that her poor father-in-law had just suffered a terrible mental breakdown. She never even got the chance to say a single word. 5 heavily armed police officers flooded directly into the narrow space of my private study. They moved with absolute tactical precision. They raised their service weapons and pointed them straight at the center of the room. The commanding officer roared at Darius and Chloe to put their hands exactly where he could see them. He demanded that they freeze and interlock their fingers behind their heads. The sheer, overwhelming force of the police presence completely sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Darius let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He immediately raised his trembling hands high into the air, exposing his sweaty palms. Chloe froze in pure shock. The stack of fraudulent transfer documents slipped from her grasp and scattered across the hardwood floor. She slowly raised her pale hands, her arrogant confidence completely shattered by the sight of 5 loaded weapons aimed directly at her chest. I remained perfectly seated behind my heavy oak desk. I did not raise my hands. I did not make a single sudden movement. I kept my posture completely relaxed and my face entirely calm. The commanding officer looked at me and gave a short, respectful nod, confirming that the primary target was safely secured. Then the crowd of armed officers parted slightly right down the middle of the hallway. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed against the floorboards. The footsteps did not belong to a police officer. They belonged to a woman walking with the absolute supreme authority of an apex predator. Jada walked right through the splintered doorway and stepped into my study. She looked absolutely magnificent. She was wearing a flawless tailored charcoal designer suit that radiated pure aggressive power. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sharp, elegant style. She was holding a sleek black leather briefcase in her left hand. She surveyed the chaotic scene inside my office with cold, calculating eyes. She looked at the armed officers securing the perimeter. She looked at Darius trembling with his hands in the air. She looked at Chloe standing frozen in sheer terror. Jada did not look like a corporate attorney arriving to mediate a simple family dispute. She looked exactly like a ruthless executioner arriving to deliver a final deadly sentence. She stepped over the scattered fraudulent documents resting on the floor. She did not even bother to look down at them. She walked straight to the edge of my heavy oak desk and stood right next to my leather chair. She placed her sleek briefcase down on the polished wood. She looked directly at Chloe and smiled a smile so incredibly cold it could freeze a raging river. The trap was completely sprung. The steel jaws were clamped tight around their necks, and Jada was holding the only key. The heavy tactical boots of the police officers echoed loudly in the small study as they completely surrounded the room. Darius realized he was entirely cornered. But instead of surrendering with dignity, my cowardly son decided to play the ultimate victim. He slowly lowered his trembling hands to his chest and let out a pathetic fake sob. He looked directly at the heavily armed police captain and completely changed his voice. He made his tone sound incredibly soft and profoundly exhausted. He told the officers that there had been a terrible, massive misunderstanding. He claimed that his poor elderly father was suffering from a severe episode of advanced vascular dementia. He pointed a shaking finger at me sitting quietly behind my heavy oak desk. He told the police I was completely out of my mind and that I must have accidentally triggered some kind of old medical alert panic button in my extreme confusion. He begged the officers to please lower their heavy service weapons. He spun a pathetic, vicious lie claiming that he and his wife were simply trying to help me calm down during a violent mental breakdown. He said they loved me very much and were just trying to keep me safe in my own home. I watched my own flesh and blood lie directly to law enforcement trying to weaponize my age and my race against me. He was perfectly willing to have me hauled away to a locked psychiatric ward just to save himself from going to state prison. Chloe saw the tiny window of opportunity and immediately launched herself right through it. She dropped to her knees on the woven vintage rug, completely ignoring the police weapons pointed in her direction. She frantically gathered the scattered fraudulent transfer documents from the hardwood floor. She snatched the fake medical affidavit signed by her cousin Trent. She stood back up and shoved the crisp white papers directly toward the broad chest of the police captain. She raised her chin and put on her best display of arrogant privilege. She declared with absolute fake authority that she and Darius were my official legal guardians. She stated loudly that they had absolute concrete medical proof of my rapid cognitive decline. She claimed I was a physical danger to myself and to the public. She demanded that the police stand down immediately and let them handle this tragic family medical situation privately. The police captain lowered his weapon slightly and reached out his heavy-gloved hand to take the documents from Chloe. But before his thick fingers could even brush the edge of the paper, Jada stepped directly between them. My brilliant corporate attorney moved with the smooth, aggressive grace of a hunting panther. She intercepted the stack of papers, pulling them right out of Chloe's pale hands with absolute authority. Jada held the forged transfer deed and the fake medical evaluation in her perfectly manicured fingers. She did not even bother to read them closely. She just glanced at the fresh ink of my signature and then looked at the fake doctor seal stamped at the very bottom. Then Jada did something that completely shattered the thick, terrifying tension in the room. She laughed. It was not a warm or friendly sound. It was a sharp, freezing, cold corporate laugh that held absolutely zero humor. It was the terrifying laugh of an apex predator who had just watched its foolish prey walk directly into a solid brick wall. The sound of her laughter echoed off the dark oak walls of my private study, making Chloe flinch backward in pure confusion. Jada looked Chloe dead in the eyes. The height difference and the sheer magnificent power radiating from my attorney made my daughter-in-law look like a shrinking, pathetic child. Jada told Chloe that she clearly did not bother to read the corporate bylaws governing my estate. She casually flipped the fraudulent living deed of transfer in her hand. She told Chloe that she was currently holding the most expensive piece of toilet paper in the entire state of Georgia. Chloe's arrogant mask completely faltered. Her blue eyes darted back and forth between Jada and the armed police officers. She stammered and demanded to know who Jada was and what she was doing interfering in private family business. She yelled that she had a certified medical affidavit and demanded that Jada hand the legal papers back immediately. She actually tried to reach out and snatch the documents back, but Jada simply stepped aside, letting Chloe grab nothing but empty air. Jada introduced herself with cold, brutal efficiency. She stated her full name and her position as the primary corporate counsel for Jenkins Commercial Holdings. She explained very slowly so that Chloe could fully comprehend her own colossal stupidity that she personally managed a $12 million commercial real estate portfolio that Chloe had just foolishly attempted to steal. The exact dollar amount hit the police officers like a physical shockwave. The captain raised his eyebrows in surprise. Darius let out a whimpering gasp, knowing his deeply hidden secret was completely exposed to the authorities. Jada raised the signed transfer document so the police captain could see it clearly in the warm light of my desk lamp. She turned her fierce, dark gaze back to my son and my daughter-in-law. She began to explain the poison pill protocol to the entire room. She spoke with brutal, terrifying legal clarity, breaking down their absolute destruction piece by piece. She told Chloe and Darius that my entire $12 million net worth was held securely inside an irrevocable blind trust. She stated that the trust contained a highly specific, highly aggressive security trigger designed entirely to prevent elder abuse and financial extortion. Jada explained that by forcing me to sign a living deed of transfer outside of her direct physical legal presence, they did not successfully transfer a single penny into their greedy hands. Instead, they had just triggered an automatic, catastrophic lockdown of my entire financial empire. She smiled a vicious, calculating smile. She told them that the very moment my pen lifted from that crisp white paper, the digital system instantly froze every single bank account. It locked every single property deed across the city. And most importantly, it automatically dispatched the police captain and his heavily armed officers to this exact address for a verified active extortion attempt. I watched the devastating realization wash over Chloe's pale face. Her eyes widened in absolute sheer horror as she finally understood the massive magnitude of her fatal mistake. The signature she had fought so incredibly hard to get, the signature she had just cheered and danced over, was the exact trigger that summoned her own destruction. She had literally forced me to lock her inside a federal prison cell. She thought she was outsmarting a frail old man, but she had actually been outmaneuvered by a master mechanic and a brilliant legal mind. Jada looked down at the terrified, trembling couple. She told them that the document she was holding was entirely legally void for the purpose of transferring any wealth whatsoever. She took a deliberate step closer to Chloe, forcing my daughter-in-law to shrink back against the heavy wooden bookshelf. Jada lowered her voice to a deadly serious whisper that carried across the quiet study. She said that unfortunately for them, the document served as absolute physical, concrete evidence of armed felony extortion and severe elder abuse. She stated that my signature proved they forced my hand, and the hidden cameras recording in my study proved they used a deadly weapon to do it. The trap had officially sprung completely shut. The heavy steel jaws of justice were clamped tightly around their greedy necks, and my brilliant lawyer was holding the only key. Darius collapsed onto his knees on the woven vintage rug, burying his sweating face in his shaking hands. He let out a loud, pathetic wail, knowing his life was entirely over. Chloe stood perfectly still, her breathing rapid and shallow, as her entire fake, luxurious universe crumbled into absolute dust right before her terrified eyes. I remained perfectly seated behind my heavy oak desk, watching the flawless execution of my plan. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for either of them. The walls of my private study felt like they were closing in on the two criminals standing in front of me. Chloe was hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of federal prison loomed over her head. She looked at Jada standing there with absolute corporate authority, and she realized her fake medical documents were completely useless. But desperate, greedy people never surrender with grace. They fight dirty until their very last breath. Chloe turned her frantic, pale eyes toward the heavily armed police captain. She raised a shaking finger and pointed it directly at my face. She began to scream at the top of her lungs. She yelled that I was completely crazy. She shrieked that I was a senile old fool who had no idea what I was doing. She desperately tried to convince the tactical officers that Jada was a rogue, manipulative lawyer taking advantage of a sick, vulnerable elder. She cried fake tears and claimed that she and Darius were the true victims in this chaotic room. She begged the captain to arrest Jada and force me into a psychiatric ward before I hurt myself. Her performance was loud and desperate and absolutely pathetic. She thought if she screamed loud enough, her lies would somehow become the truth. She thought her white privilege and her designer blazer would automatically shield her from the heavy consequences of her felony extortion. She was entirely wrong. I decided that my own acting performance was officially over. I placed my large, calloused hands flat against the polished surface of my heavy oak desk. I pushed myself up from my leather chair. I did not move with the slow, trembling hesitation of a broken old man. I did not let my shoulders slump forward. I stood up at my absolute full height. I am a man who spent 40 grueling years lifting massive steel engine blocks and carrying heavy machinery parts. I stood tall and proud, and I completely towered over the room. The sudden physical transformation was so aggressive and so undeniable that it made Chloe stop screaming instantly. Her mouth hung open in pure shock as she looked up at the giant standing behind the desk. I looked directly at the police captain. I did not speak with a weak, trembling whisper. I spoke with a crystal-clear, intimidating authority that commanded absolute respect from every single person in the room. I told the officers to stop listening to the frantic lies of a desperate extortionist. I raised my arm and pointed my finger straight at my cowardly son, kneeling on the woven vintage rug. I told the police captain that if his officers checked my son right now, they would find a fully loaded 9mm Glock shoved hastily into the waistband of his wrinkled trousers. I stated very calmly that the man, groveling on the floor, had just threatened my life with that exact weapon. The entire atmosphere inside the small study detonated the very second the word Glock left my mouth. The heavily armed police officers did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. 3 tactical officers swarmed Darius before he could even process what was happening. They tackled him with massive, overwhelming physical force. They drove his body face first directly into the hard wooden floorboards. The heavy, violent impact shook the tall bookshelves and rattled the glass on my desk lamp. Darius let out a loud, pathetic shriek of pain as a heavy tactical boot pressed firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground. One of the officers ripped the loaded firearm straight from the waistband of his trousers. The officer held the black metal weapon up in the air, shouting clear confirmation that the suspect was armed and successfully disarmed. Darius was crying uncontrollably now, pressing his sweaty face against the rug and begging the officers not to shoot him. He was a complete disgrace. He had been so incredibly eager to hold a gun to the head of his own elderly father, but the moment he faced real men with real weapons, he crumbled into a pathetic, weeping child. I did not take my eyes off the police captain. I reached across my oak desk and tapped the dark screen of my secure digital tablet resting near my brass pen holder. I told the captain that he did not have to take my word for anything that happened here tonight. I informed him that the tablet was linked to a high-definition recording device mounted directly under my desk. I stated with absolute cold precision that if he checked the video files, he would find crystal-clear audio and video of my son holding that loaded gun to my head exactly 2 minutes ago. I told him the footage also captured every single racist slur and every vicious threat his greedy wife had just screamed at me. Chloe completely lost her mind. The realization that she had been secretly recorded committing armed extortion completely broke her fragile, arrogant reality. She tried to lunge toward the desk to smash the tablet, but she did not even make it 2 steps. 2 massive police officers stepped right into her path. They grabbed her pale arms with uncompromising force and twisted them firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of cold steel handcuffs locking tightly around her wrists echoed beautifully through the study. It was the sweetest sound I had heard in months. Chloe began to kick and thrash like a rabid wild animal caught in a hunter snare. She slammed her expensive designer heels against the side of my desk, screaming vicious obscenities at the top of her lungs. She cursed at me. She cursed at Jada. She cursed at the officers securing her arms. Her elegant, sophisticated facade was utterly and permanently destroyed. Her perfect blonde hair was an absolute tangled mess covering her red blotchy face. She looked exactly like the ugly, hateful monster she truly was on the inside. Jada stepped forward and smoothly unlocked the encrypted application on my secure tablet. She handed the glowing digital screen to the police captain. The captain holstered his service weapon and took the device in his heavy hands. The room fell relatively quiet except for the pathetic sobbing coming from Darius on the floor and the ragged, angry breathing coming from Chloe in the corner. The police captain tapped the screen and watched the high-definition video play back in perfect, unassailable clarity. The volume was loud enough for everyone in the room to hear the horrific replay of their ultimate betrayal. The officers heard Chloe call me a lucky old black man who did not know his place. They heard her demand my $12 million fortune. They watched Darius step around the desk and press the cold steel barrel of the 9mm Glock directly against my right temple. They watched Chloe laugh an evil, piercing laugh and snatch the freshly signed documents, acting like she had just conquered the world. The video ended. The police captain slowly lowered the tablet. He looked up and stared at Chloe and Darius. His face was a mask of absolute, profound disgust. He was a man who dedicated his life to protecting the vulnerable citizens of Atlanta, and he had just witnessed a son threaten to execute his own father for a real estate portfolio. He handed the tablet back to Jada and thanked her for the pristine criminal evidence. The captain walked over to where Darius was pinned against the floorboards. He looked down at the boy I had raised with absolute, unfiltered contempt. He told Darius that in all his years working law enforcement, he had never seen a more pathetic, disgusting excuse for a human being. He told him he was a complete disgrace to the title of a son and a disgrace to any father who ever broke his back to provide for his family. He ordered his officers to haul the treacherous garbage out of my house immediately. The officers hauled Darius to his feet. My son could not even stand on his own. His legs were completely useless, shaking with pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at me with wide, desperate, bloodshot eyes. He opened his mouth to speak. He wanted to beg for my mercy one last time. He wanted to plead for the fatherly protection he had just tried to violently extinguish. But I did not give him the chance to say a single word. I simply turned my back on him and looked out the shattered window into the dark night. I completely erased his existence from my heart. I was no longer his father, and he was no longer my son. They dragged him roughly out of the study and down the wooden hallway. Chloe followed right behind him, fighting and spitting venom at the officers the entire way. Her screams of arrogant entitlement echoed out the front door and into the flashing lights of the police cruisers parked on my front lawn. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, severing their toxic connection to my life forever. The house was finally quiet again. The heavy, suffocating dark cloud that had settled over my home for the past 4 months was entirely lifted. The air felt clean and breathable. The violent extortion was over. The gaslighting was over. The war was officially won. I stood in my study, breathing in the deep smell of old leather and polished oak. I had defended my fortress with absolute ruthless precision. I had protected the legacy I built for my late wife. I had watched the enemies who tried to bury me dig their own massive graves and seal themselves inside. I was the master mechanic who identified the catastrophic failure, and I had successfully removed the broken toxic parts from my life for good. I walked slowly out of my private study and followed the heavy footsteps of the police officers down the wooden hallway. The cool night air blew in through the shattered living room window where the clay bricks still rested on the vintage rug. I stepped out onto the concrete front porch of my house. The entire neighborhood was completely awake now. My neighbors were standing on their front lawns, wrapped in their bathrobes, watching the massive spectacle unfolding in my driveway. I did not feel any shame or embarrassment. The shame belonged entirely to the 2 criminals being dragged across my front lawn in cold steel handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the absolute destruction of my son's arrogant facade. The police officers roughly shoved Darius and Chloe toward the heavy metal doors of the waiting patrol cruisers. The moment they realized their lavish future was completely annihilated, their toxic alliance instantly shattered into a million pieces. There is absolutely no honor among greedy thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty between 2 parasites fighting for their own survival. Chloe began to scream the very second the officer pushed her head down to clear the roof of the police car. She thrashed her body against the vehicle and aimed her vicious venom directly at her husband. She yelled at the top of her lungs so that every single police officer and neighbor could hear her desperate lies. She claimed she had absolutely no idea what was happening tonight. She shrieked that Darius was a violent gambling addict who forced her to participate in this terrible crime. She sobbed massive fake tears and swore she was just a terrified hostage trapped in his massive web of illegal debt. She completely threw the man she married directly under the heavy wheels of the justice system. She claimed Darius was the one who tampered with my medication and hid my keys. She told the police captain that she was innocent and begged them to let her go. She was entirely willing to watch my son rot in a federal prison cell for the rest of his natural life, if it meant she could walk away scot-free. Darius heard every single word of her betrayal. He was standing by the second police cruiser with his hands locked tightly behind his back. The absolute shock of his wife's immediate treachery completely broke whatever tiny, fragile piece of his mind was still intact. He began to weep uncontrollably. He cried loud, pathetic tears that echoed across the quiet suburban street. He looked at Chloe with wide, betrayed eyes, but she simply turned her face away in pure disgust. She had already discarded him like an empty wallet. Darius turned his desperate, wet face toward the front porch. He saw me standing there, leaning against the sturdy wooden railing of the home I built with my bare hands. He completely collapsed against the side of the police cruiser. He begged the officers to let him speak to his father one last time. The police captain looked at me, and I gave a very slow, deliberate nod. The captain held Darius by his shoulder and allowed him to turn and face me. My son looked up at me with tears streaming down his face and snot running from his nose. He pleaded for my mercy. He begged me to tell the officers it was all a massive misunderstanding. He swore he was just scared of the violent men looking for their money, and he never actually meant to hurt me. He asked me to forgive him and save his life, just like I always did when he was a little boy making foolish mistakes. I walked slowly down the brick steps of my front porch. I crossed the damp grass of my front lawn until I was standing just a few feet away from the police cruiser. I looked directly into the swollen, bloodshot eyes of the boy I had protected for 38 years. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The well of my parental grace was completely bone dry. I spoke to him in a voice that was perfectly calm and cold as winter ice. I told him he traded his father's love for money he never even earned. I stated a simple, brutal fact. I told him that now he had absolutely neither. Darius let out a gut-wrenching wail of pure agony. He knew my judgment was absolutely final. There would be no more second chances and no more secret financial rescues. The police officer placed his heavy hand on top of my son's head and firmly guided him into the cramped back seat of the patrol car. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a definitive, echoing thud. It was the sound of a coffin sealing shut on his entire future. I stepped back onto the sidewalk and watched the heavy police vehicles pull away from my property. The loud wailing sirens began to fade into the distance, carrying my treacherous son and his greedy wife far away from my peaceful life. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared around the corner, leaving my quiet neighborhood bathed in the soft yellow glow of the street lamps. I stood there for a long moment, letting the crisp night air fill my lungs. The toxic disease had been successfully extracted from my home. I turned around and walked back up the brick steps. I crossed the threshold and stepped into my quiet house. Jada was waiting for me in the living room. My brilliant corporate attorney had already taken control of the chaotic aftermath. She was standing near the shattered front window, talking quietly but firmly on her sleek mobile phone. She ended the call and turned to face me with a look of profound professional respect. Jada told me she had just dispatched a 24-hour emergency repair crew to board up the broken window and sweep the floor for glass. She assured me the heavy security presence would remain stationed at the end of my street for the next several weeks, just to ensure my absolute physical safety. I thanked her for her flawless execution of the poison pill protocol. I told her she had orchestrated the entire legal trap with absolute mastery. Jada smiled a fierce, proud smile. She opened her leather briefcase and carefully secured the fraudulent transfer documents inside. She told me those papers were now the primary physical evidence for the district attorney. She confirmed that the blind trust was completely impenetrable, and my $12 million commercial real estate portfolio was locked down tighter than a Federal Reserve bank. No one could touch a single penny of my wealth. My legacy was entirely safe. We walked together into my private study. The room was a mess of scattered papers and displaced chairs, but it felt remarkably clean. Jada helped me pick up the discarded documents from the woven vintage rug. We worked in a comfortable, companionable silence. When the room was finally put back in order, she shook my hand firmly and told me she would handle all the legal fallout in the morning. She promised I would never have to sit in a room with Darius or Chloe ever again unless it was a sterile courtroom during their criminal sentencing. Jada walked out the front door, leaving me alone in the wonderful, beautiful silence of my reclaimed home. Later that exact same night, the long arm of justice continued to sweep through the city. Jada sent me a highly encrypted message detailing the swift arrest of Chloe's cousin Trent. The arrogant man who pretended to be a prestigious neurologist was sleeping soundly in his upscale apartment when the police kicked his door down. He tried to claim he was a legitimate medical professional, but the authorities already possessed the high-definition video of his extortion negotiation on my front porch. Trent tried to flee through his back patio, but the tactical officers tackled him into his own swimming pool. They dragged him out, dripping wet, and slapped cold steel handcuffs on his wrists. He was charged with severe medical fraud conspiracy to commit extortion and elder abuse. The fake medical affidavit he signed so proudly was the exact piece of evidence the district attorney used to deny him bail. His entire fake medical career was completely annihilated in a single night. The final loose end of this terrible nightmare resolved itself without me ever having to lift a single finger. The ruthless loan sharks who threw the brick through my window operated on a very strict underground code of survival. Word travels incredibly fast in the dark criminal underbelly of Atlanta. By sunrise, the local street bosses heard that Darius Jenkins was arrested on massive felony armed extortion charges with heavy federal implications. The loan sharks realized immediately that Darius was going to federal prison for a very long time. They knew that trying to collect a gambling debt from a man locked inside a maximum security cell was absolutely impossible. More importantly, they knew that the entire Jenkins estate was now surrounded by aggressive corporate lawyers and heavy police scrutiny. The illegal loan agency decided that pursuing the $250,000 was far too dangerous and brought entirely too much heat to their shadow operations. The dangerous men simply cut their massive financial losses and vanished completely back into the dark alleys of the city. The violent physical threat to my life was entirely and permanently neutralized. I walked through my quiet house, checking the sturdy locks on the doors and windows. The emergency repair crew had securely boarded up the broken glass in the living room. The heavy silence that settled over the brick walls was no longer tense or suffocating. It was a warm, welcoming peace. I walked into my bedroom and opened the hidden compartment inside the antique sewing machine. I removed the burner phone and powered it down permanently. I did not need to hide in the shadows of my own home anymore. I went into my bathroom and washed my face with warm water. I looked at the tired but unbroken man staring back at me in the mirror. I had survived a brutal betrayal by my own flesh and blood. I had watched my son choose greed over love, and I had watched him pay the ultimate devastating price for his terrible choice. I walked back to my heavy oak desk in the study and picked up the silver-framed photograph of my beautiful Vivian. I wiped a small speck of dust from the glass and placed her picture upright where it belonged. I looked at her bright smile and told her the house was finally clean. I turned off the desk lamp and went to sleep feeling like a completely free and wealthy man. 6 months have passed since that terrible night. I am sitting on the front porch of my home in my favorite wooden rocking chair. The warm Atlanta breeze carries the sweet smell of blooming magnolias across the front lawn. I hold a tall glass of cold iced tea in my calloused right hand. The ice cubes clink softly against the glass. It is a beautiful, peaceful afternoon. There are no shattered windows in my living room anymore. There are no toxic whispers echoing down the hallway. The house is completely silent, and the silence is an absolute blessing. I look out at the quiet street and reflect on the absolute finality of justice. The legal system moved with incredible speed thanks to the undeniable video evidence recorded in my private study. I sat in the front row of the heavy wooden courtroom and watched the federal judge hand down the final sentences. Darius stood before the bench wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. The boy I raised looked entirely broken and completely hollow. He stared at the floor the entire time. The judge sentenced my only son to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison for armed robbery and severe elder abuse. Chloe stood next to him looking absolutely terrified. The arrogant smirk on her pale face was gone forever. The judge sentenced her to 10 years in a federal facility for felony conspiracy and massive medical fraud. They did not even look at each other as the armed bailiffs led them away in heavy steel handcuffs. They turned on each other viciously during the long trial, but the undeniable truth buried them both. I watched them walk through those heavy wooden doors, and I felt absolutely nothing. I had successfully cut the poison out of my life, even though that poison shared my own blood. I did not let their massive betrayal destroy my spirit. I took the deep sorrow and turned it into a powerful driving force. I met with my brilliant corporate attorney Jada several times over the past 6 months. We completely dismantled the blind trust that protected my assets during the armed extortion attempt. We took my entire $12 million commercial real estate empire and converted it into a massive educational foundation. I sold the 3 shopping plazas to a major national developer. I used every single penny of that incredible fortune to build and fund specialized trade schools across the city of Atlanta. I spent 40 years of my life covered in dark engine grease and toxic hydraulic fluid. I know the profound, immense value of learning a physical trade. I know the absolute dignity of building a life with your own 2 bare hands. My new educational foundation provides full scholarships and top-tier mechanical training for young African-American men and women who want to work hard and build their own legacy. I am giving them the exact same opportunity I tried to give my son, but these young students actually have the hunger and the deep respect to earn it. I visit the large training workshops every single week. I watch these bright young mechanics working on massive diesel engines and heavy machinery parts. They call me Mr. Terry, and they treat me with absolute profound respect. I finally have a real family again. I have a massive family of hardworking young people who value my wisdom and honor my legacy. The wealth I built will generate new wealth and new opportunities for generations of people who truly deserve it. Yesterday afternoon, I drove my old 12-year-old truck down to the quiet, peaceful cemetery on the edge of the city. I walked across the green grass carrying a large, beautiful bouquet of bright yellow wildflowers. I stopped right in front of the polished marble headstone marking the resting place of my beautiful wife, Vivian. I knelt down slowly and placed the fresh flowers on the soft green grass. I ran my rough fingers over the letters of her engraved name. I spoke to her spirit in the quiet afternoon air. I told her that the heavy, dark storm had finally passed. I told her all about the new trade schools and the bright young students who were learning how to build their own futures. I confessed that the brutal battle with our son broke my heart into 1,000 pieces, but I assured her that the heart had fully healed stronger than ever before. I looked at the beautiful marble stone and I told my wife that I had finally cleaned up the house. I told her the toxic garbage was permanently thrown out and the foundation of our home was secure once again. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my knees, and walked away from her grave. I walked back to my old, reliable truck as a completely free, wealthy, and unbroken man. Blood may write the first chapter of our lives, but it does not give anyone the right to dictate the ending. We often blind ourselves to the cruelty of our own family, hoping our endless sacrifices will somehow buy their genuine love and respect. But greed is a bottomless pit, and entitlement knows no gratitude. True strength is not found in endless suffering for those who view you as a resource. It is found in the courage to walk away and demand the dignity you deserve. Real family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, not opportunistic exploitation. Never apologize for protecting your peace, your legacy, and your life. If my journey resonated with you today, please take a moment to leave a comment below and share your own story of overcoming family betrayal. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story of justice and survival. Thank you so much for listening, and always remember to protect your peace.